Hello everyone, welcome to Bedtime Nightmares. I've made this video to help you fall asleep. Before you do that, please like the video and subscribe. Let me know what time it is with you and where you're watching from in the comments too. Now lay back, relax, and settle in for some chilling stories. I've been on the fence about sharing this for ages, but with all these true horror stories popping up online, I guess it's time I wrote mine down. Maybe it'll give me some closure or help someone else see the red flags I missed. My name's Carmen, and this happened about 3 years ago. I was living in Cornwall back then, working remotely for a small publishing company. The nature of my job meant I could travel a bit, so my best mate Lucy and I decided to take a camping holiday in the New Forest. It was supposed to be a fun getaway from our usual routines, and for a while it was. I'm sharing this now because I've moved to Scotland since then. I feel safer putting distance, both physical and emotional, between me and what happened. But sometimes I still wake up sweating, remembering the storm and those strange faces in the trees. Lucy and I weren't complete novices to camping. We grew up taking school trips to campsites with those big military-style tents that weigh a ton. But we were hardly experts either, so we settled on a designated campsite near the forest's edge, rather than plunging deep into untamed wilderness. The plan was to stay for 3 nights, a long weekend to clear our heads. On the first day, the weather was brilliant. Blue skies, a mild breeze. We set up our tent easily. Lucy hammered the pegs in whilst I inflated the air mattresses. We joked about being adulting champions and treated ourselves to a barbecue dinner. After that, we sat around a small campfire, sipped some wine, and gazed at the stars. It felt perfect, like the sort of night you'd write a poem about. But the forecast for the following day predicted a storm. Typically British, right? One day of sunshine, then the skies open up. We decided to stick it out. We'd brought decent gear, waterproof tent, sturdy boots, thick coats, and we were excited to see if we could handle a bit of adverse weather. That second morning, the clouds rolled in, gray and menacing. We took a short hike before the rain started, exploring the forest paths. The trees were dense, casting cool shadows even in the midday gloom. We saw a few other campers and hikers, exchanged polite nods, nothing unusual. Lucy stopped at one point to take photos of wildflowers. I remember the hush of the woods, broken only by distant birdsong and the crunch of our steps. Peaceful, really. We got back to camp just as the first drops of rain began to fall. Another tent had been pitched about 20 meters away from ours. 2 young lads, maybe in their mid-20s, were attempting to build a fire under a tarpaulin. Not the cleverest idea. We gave them a wave and retreated to our tent to wait out the rain with a deck of cards and some leftover sandwiches. By late afternoon, the heavens truly opened. Thunder rumbled, lightning split the sky. Our tent held up well, though the wind battered the sides relentlessly. Lucy and I were warm enough, though the vibe had definitely shifted from romantic countryside retreat to we're stuck in a soggy tent. But around dinner time, something weirder happened. We heard voices, chanting, or at least rhythmic talking. It was faint, carried on the wind through the trees. Lucy and I paused our card game, exchanging a concerned look. It sounded like multiple people speaking in low voices. We tried to brush it off as some group of campers singing or telling ghost stories. The noise died down soon after, so we let it go. The next day, we woke up to a clearing sky. The storm was supposed to continue on and off, but in the early morning, we had a lull. Eager for a proper walk, Lucy and I put on our boots and headed deeper into the forest. We planned to do a loop trail, about 6 or 7 miles total. The forest was breathtaking, with swirling mists hanging amongst the trunks. We barely encountered anyone else, save for a few dog walkers near the campsite. Around midday, we stumbled upon a secluded patch where the undergrowth had been flattened, almost like people had been standing in a circle. There were odd symbols scratched into the dirt, interlocking triangles, some kind of spiral. I'm not superstitious, but I got an uneasy feeling. Lucy joked that it was probably just hippie stuff, or some bored teens messing around. We took a few photos, half laughing at our own paranoia. Still, the atmosphere felt heavier somehow, like the forest was hiding secrets. We continued our hike but couldn't shake the sense of being watched. At one point, Lucy swore she saw a figure dart behind a tree, wearing a gray hooded cloak. But when we checked, nobody was there. We tried to laugh it off, attributing it to nerves and the lingering tension from the previous night's storm. We decided to head back to camp a bit earlier than planned. Back at our tent, the two lads from the neighboring site were gone, leaving behind an extinguished fire pit. In their place, another tent had popped up a bit further away, with two older women sharing a pot of tea. The campsite manager's hut was all the way at the front, near the main road, a good 15-minute walk away. We considered heading that way to ask if anything odd had been reported, but ultimately decided we were probably overreacting. That evening, Lucy insisted we go looking for the source of that chanting. It had started again, just after sunset. The storm clouds returned, thunder rolling in the distance. We put on our waterproof jackets, grabbed torches, and ventured into the trees. I had a bad feeling from the start. The forest was dark, the ground slippery. Every gust of wind made the branches creak, sounding eerily like someone sighing. As we moved deeper, the chanting grew louder. At first, it was a series of low hums, rising and falling like a tide. Then distinct voices emerged, though we couldn't make out the words. We turned off our torches, not wanting to announce our presence. I remember my heart pounding so hard I worried whoever was chanting would hear it. Eventually, we inched close enough to see a flickering orange light through the branches. A fire, presumably. Creeping closer, we peered from behind a thick oak. There, in a small clearing, stood a group of maybe 8 or 9 people in dark, hooded cloaks. They formed a circle around a bonfire, swaying in unison. Symbols like the ones we'd found earlier were drawn on the ground. My stomach lurched. This wasn't some casual gathering. It felt organized, ritualistic even. Lucy's eyes were wide with both fear and fascination. We stayed silent, trying to figure out if we should film it on our phones or just run. Before we could decide, the chanting stopped abruptly. One of the figures stepped forward. They pulled back their hood, revealing a young woman with shaved hair and intense eyes. She looked right at us, like she knew exactly where we were hiding. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice carrying easily through the rain-soaked trees. Panic coursed through my veins. Lucy grabbed my sleeve. We both ducked behind the trunk, trying to stay out of sight. Then we heard rustling, footsteps approaching. Another voice hissed, "Over here." We bolted. In the confusion, we splashed through puddles, snagged our coats on low branches, hardly able to see the trail. Shouts echoed behind us, and we knew more than one person was giving chase. My lungs burned as we sprinted back toward the campsite. Lightning flashed across the sky, illuminating the twisted branches overhead. After a frantic few minutes, we burst out onto the campsite grounds. The older women by their tents saw us, eyes widening in alarm. One called out, "Everything all right, love?" But we didn't stop to explain. We tore into our own tent, zipping it shut as though that flimsy layer of nylon could protect us. Raindrops pounded the fabric. My heart hammered in my ears, Lucy's breathing ragged. "What was that?" Lucy whispered, trembling. "A cult? A group of weirdos?" We debated packing up immediately, but it was pitch black and the storm was intensifying. We decided to wait until morning, then leave as soon as we could. My hands shook for ages afterwards. Eventually, exhaustion overtook us. At around 3 in the morning, I woke up to the sound of footsteps outside our tent. I froze, barely daring to breathe. Lucy stirred, noticing my tension. We listened. Someone was circling, the soft crunch of pine needles underfoot. Then a muffled voice. "We saw them run this way." My blood turned to ice. Lucy quietly reached for her phone. No signal. Typical. We had no clue how many were out there or what they wanted. We heard a faint scraping sound, like fingernails running along the tent's fabric. Lucy stifled a gasp. We both stayed silent, waiting for them to move on. Eventually, after what felt like forever, the footsteps receded, but neither of us got any more sleep that night. The next morning, the sky was a dull gray, the forest dripping from the overnight rain. We decided we'd had enough. We packed our tent in record time, though we noticed a few footprints in the muddy ground around us, definitely not ours. Someone had been standing there, perhaps multiple people. The older women near us had already gone. Their tent spot was empty. We hurried to the manager's hut to check out. Inside, we found a middle-aged man in a green fleece, tapping on a laptop. We told him we'd had a run-in with some suspicious individuals in the woods, that they might be on the campsite. He gave us a skeptical look, like he'd heard every tall tale from spooked campers. Nevertheless, we insisted he at least warn the other guests. He offered to ring the local police station, though he pointed out that if it was just a group of odd campers, there wasn't much they could do unless a crime was committed. Annoyed but eager to leave, we thanked him and drove off. We thought that was the end of it. But a day later, back at Lucy's flat in Plymouth, I found weird scratches on the side of my car, tiny triangular symbols etched into the paint near the boot. My heart dropped when I spotted them. Lucy swore she'd seen them before, on the ground in that hidden clearing. The realization that someone might have followed us out of the forest to sabotage my car terrified us both. Over the next few days, Lucy and I stayed indoors, refusing to split up. We felt unsettled, like we were being watched. I remember returning from a quick dash to the corner shop, feeling eyes on me every step of the way. But no one confronted us directly. A week later, Lucy's post went missing. Nothing arrived in her letterbox for days, though the neighbors received theirs without issue. We found a single folded note by the door, with more of those triangular symbols scrawled in black ink. No words, just shapes. That was the last straw. Lucy phoned the local police, who said they'd send someone to check on us. Whether they ever really believed us is unclear. We had no real evidence beyond the note and the marks on my car, which could have been done by kids for all they knew. But the worst incident came on the 10th day after we left the campsite. Lucy and I decided to confront whoever was behind this, if we could figure it out. We returned to the new forest during daylight, armed with pepper spray we'd purchased online. Technically not something we should carry, but we were desperate. We followed the same trail to the clearing, half expecting to find the circle of symbols. But it was gone, or at least the ground had been scuffed up. No sign of a bonfire or cloaked figures. Then a shout came from behind. We turned to see two men in dark hoodies approaching. One of them, tall with a shaved head, had the same intense look I'd seen in the woman's eyes that night. He demanded to know why we'd come back. Lucy told them we wanted answers. Why were they following us? What were they doing out here? They laughed, a mirthless sound. You outsiders don't understand. We're protecting this land from people like you. My stomach turned. Did they see themselves as guardians of the forest or something more sinister? One of the men lunged at Lucy, grabbing her arm. She screamed, a shrill sound that seemed to startle him. I fumbled for the pepper spray, my hands shaking. I blasted it in his direction, catching part of his face. He staggered back, howling. The other man advanced, fury twisting his features. Lucy, adrenaline pumping, kicked at his legs. I swung my arm, still clutching the can, and managed to strike him across the shoulder. He stumbled, giving us a split second to run. We tore through the trees, our hearts thumping. We could hear them yelling behind us, threatening more violence. The chase felt like it lasted forever, but eventually we found a public footpath where a family of hikers was passing by. At the sight of these bystanders, the cloaked men melted away into the undergrowth. We told the hikers what happened, though we were so panicked we probably sounded unhinged. They offered to walk us back towards the road. Once there, Lucy and I called the police again. We met officers at a nearby car park and explained everything, including the chanting and the note. They promised to investigate. Still, it felt like we were being brushed off. No firm leads, no official records of suspicious gatherings. After that confrontation, the harassment stopped. No more mysterious marks on the car, no strange notes. It was as if the group had decided we weren't worth the hassle, or maybe they'd moved on to a different area for their rituals. Lucy and I concluded they were part of some organized cult with a presence in the forest, though we never learned its name or purpose. The false sense of security they'd given initially, just seeming like fellow campers, was what unsettled me the most. They looked normal until you got too close. Within a few months, Lucy relocated to Manchester, partly out of fear. I decided to move further north, to Glasgow, for a fresh start. We still keep in touch and we rarely talk about those nights in the forest, but I know it changed us. We're more wary, quicker to question strangers' motives. We also made a pact never to go camping without a bigger group. or at the very least without letting family know exactly where we are and what times we'll be back. To this day, I sometimes wonder if the chanting was all in my imagination, but Lucy heard it too, and we both remember the circle, the symbols, the hooded figures. There was nothing imaginary about how those men attacked us or how one brushed off pepper spray like it was a mild inconvenience. So that's my story. If you're ever camping in remote areas, especially places as vast and quiet as some parts of Britain's forests, please be cautious. Pay attention to strange sounds. Keep your phone charged. And if you see odd signs scratched into the dirt, maybe don't investigate. I wish I'd listened to my gut sooner. I'm posting this now and hope someone might recognize the symbols or have had a similar experience. Part of me wants answers. Who were they, and what were they doing? Another part of me just wants to forget and move on, but sharing helps. So take care out there, everyone. Sometimes the real monsters are the ones wearing unassuming faces lurking just beyond the glow of your torchlight. Hello, everyone. I've decided to share this story now because I've finally moved away from the city where it happened, and I feel like enough time has passed that I can piece it all together without spiraling into a complete panic. Still, just thinking about it makes my stomach twist. I guess there's no easy way to tell a story like this, but I'll do my best to be as honest as possible. I need to let it out. Maybe it'll help someone else who's been in a similar situation. I've lived in London most of my life. I grew up in a modest flat near Finsbury Park, but after landing a job in marketing, I moved to a slightly posher area closer to the city center. It wasn't fancy, but at least it was convenient for commuting. I used to be a big believer in daily routines, parking my little second-hand car in the same spot every morning, leaving work at a set time to avoid the worst of the rush, that sort of thing. But it was precisely my predictable schedule that got me into trouble. I was working at a marketing firm near Canary Wharf at the time. Lots of glass buildings, fancy coffee shops, and bustling sidewalks. My hours were typically 9 to 6, but on the day this happened, I had to stay later to finish up a client presentation. By the time I left the office, it was 7:30, which still counted as rush hour in that part of town. There was a queue of traffic winding down the main road, horns blaring at zebra crossings, and crowds of tired office workers rushing to catch trains. My car was parked in an underground parking facility a few blocks away from the building. When I first started working there, I felt safer parking underground, less chance of break-ins or random vandalism, and I usually appreciated the convenience of just hopping into my car after work without dealing with constant drizzle or pushing through the sweaty throngs. That night, though, I quickly came to regret my choice. I remember descending the concrete ramp into the car park, the fluorescent lights flickering overhead. It felt colder down there somehow, even though it was July. My footsteps echoed as I made my way past rows of vehicles. I'd parked right at the far end, near one of those pillars with chipped paint and graffiti scrawled across the lower half. As I turned the corner, I saw him, a man, maybe mid-30s, wearing a neat button-down shirt and dark trousers. He looked like any other office worker. That's what unsettled me most, how ordinary he looked. He was standing beside my car, not doing anything suspicious at first glance, just lingering, as if checking his phone. I slowed down, uncertain whether to say something. My daily routine had taught me to be polite yet cautious in car parks. You never know who you might run into. I often reminded myself of basic safety rules. Be alert, hold your keys between your fingers if you sense danger, etc. Evening, I offered casually, my keys jingling in my hand. He nodded, a hint of a smile crossing his face, but didn't speak. It was then I noticed he was standing a bit too close to the driver's side door of my car. It wasn't necessarily threatening, just off. I approached and motioned towards my car, silently indicating I needed to get in. He stepped aside, still not speaking. I unlocked the door, slid into the driver's seat, and carefully closed it behind me. I'd exhaled half a sigh of relief when I realized he was still right there, eyeing me through the window. That made me feel uneasy enough to quickly lock the doors. I tried to start the engine, but it coughed once and died. My heart rate spiked immediately. It wasn't the first time the old girl had given me trouble. The ignition coil had played up a week earlier. But at that moment, with that man standing a foot away, the situation felt dangerously claustrophobic. Another turn of the key, another dead cough. Panic rose in my throat. I glanced up. He was still there, smiling this time, an odd grin that didn't reach his eyes. I tried a third time. Nothing. Anxiety prickled up my spine. I forced myself to breathe. Come on, I whispered. The man's grin widened. He reached out and tapped the window. 3 slow, deliberate taps. My mind screamed at me not to open the door, not to roll down the window. Instead, I stared straight ahead, turned the key again. The engine refused to turn over. It was then he tried the handle. The door was locked, but hearing him tug at it set my nerves on fire. I snatched up my phone. No signal in the underground structure. My heart pounded so loudly, I could almost hear blood rushing in my ears. I decided to try a different tactic. If I couldn't drive out, I could at least leave the car and make a run for it. I snatched my bag, steadied my breathing, and looked in the rearview mirror. The man moved behind my car, out of sight. I didn't like that one bit. I needed to know where he was if I was going to escape. The next few moments were a blur of adrenaline. With my keys clenched in my fist, I pushed the door open, stepped out, and slammed it shut. The car beeped as it locked automatically, which was at least one good sign. The man's footsteps sounded behind me. I didn't look back. I ran. I darted between parked cars, heading for the ramp that led to the street. My footsteps echoed in the empty corridor of concrete. The overhead lights flickered, each blink of darkness sending a jolt of fear through me. My arms pumped, my lungs burned. I could still hear his footsteps behind me, getting louder, heavier, more urgent. I realized with sickening certainty that he was chasing me. This unassuming man with a neat shirt and an unsettling grin. I reached the lift area near the exit, pressed the button for ground level. The doors took ages to open. Too long. I risked a glance over my shoulder. He was there, maybe 10 meters away, walking now, almost sauntering as if enjoying the chase. My stomach nodded at his calm expression, that unsettling half-smile as though he already knew how it would end. When the lift doors finally opened, I jumped inside and hit the close button repeatedly. He sprinted the remaining distance, and for a terrifying second, I thought he'd managed to wedge his hand between the doors. But they slid shut just in time. The metal shook as if something collided with it from the outside. My heart hammered in my chest so fiercely I thought I might black out. The lift rose to ground level, and I tried to collect my thoughts. As soon as the doors parted, I rushed into the lobby area of the car park's entrance. Normally, there's a security guard behind a small desk, but that night, it was empty. Perhaps they were doing their rounds, or maybe they'd taken a break. I didn't have time to check. The glass doors leading onto the street were a few steps away. I hurled myself out onto the pavement, gulping in fresh air. The roar of traffic, the swirl of people heading home, it all enveloped me. Relief flooded me momentarily. I was in a public place, with bright lights, rushing cars, and passers-by. The advantage was mine now, wasn't it? I must have looked completely deranged, panting and wide-eyed as I glanced back over my shoulder. For a moment, I didn't see him. I tried to calm down, rationalize the situation. Maybe he was just messing with me. Maybe he wasn't going to come out into the street after all. I noticed a small group of people waiting at a bus stop further down. If I hurried towards them, I'd be safer, surrounded by potential witnesses, right? That's when I saw him again. He emerged from a side door. He'd ditched the neat, predatory smile, and now wore an expression of raw anger. My instincts flared. I started weaving through the throng of people on the pavement, my eyes scanning for any route of escape. The overhead traffic lights turned green, unleashing a wave of cars that forced me to remain on the pavement for a few precious seconds. He picked up speed, pushing past a couple of pedestrians. I couldn't believe nobody intervened. It was rush hour, yes, but ironically, that sometimes means people are even less likely to help. Everyone's in a hurry, or simply not paying attention, their eyes glued to phones, or fixed on the crosswalk signal. I shouted for help, but my voice was nearly lost in the cacophony of engines, horns, and city noise. I spotted a sign for a small convenience shop just across the intersection. That seemed like my best shot. If I could get inside, maybe the shopkeeper would call the police, or at least there'd be more people around to deter him. When the traffic lights finally changed, I bolted across the road. My entire body shook with adrenaline, but I kept going, charging through the mass of people. Some gave me odd looks. Others muttered curses as I brushed past them. The door of the shop chimed as I stumbled inside, nearly crashing into a display of crisps. The cashier, a weary-looking older woman, shot me a concerned glance. I gasped. "Someone's after me. Please, can you help me call the police?" She hesitated, eyebrows knitting together in confusion. Before she could reply, the door chimed again. He walked in, calm, composed, not even breathless. His eyes locked onto mine, and I saw a flicker of triumph. It was as if he was saying, "You can't run from me." My stomach lurched. I didn't understand why he was doing this, what he wanted. But I knew I wasn't safe, not even here. Instinct took over. I shouted at the cashier, "Lock the door!" Then I dashed towards the back of the shop, where I guessed there might be a staff-only area. The man advanced slowly, as if wanting to corner me. The cashier, realizing something was terribly wrong, fumbled for the phone on the counter. The shop's back door led to a narrow corridor stacked with crates of drinks. I shoved some in his path, hoping to slow him down. He cursed loudly, stumbling over the crates. This bought me a second's advantage. I spotted another exit sign further down the corridor. A wave of relief washed over me as I saw a door with a push bar. I slammed into it with my shoulder, bursting out into an alley behind the shop. The alleyway reeked of rubbish, and I nearly slipped on something slick. My heart hammered as I looked around. No crowds this time, just tall brick walls and a single street lamp flickering overhead. My breath came in short, sharp gasps, and I tried to slow down enough to think clearly. My phone still had no signal. Typical city dead zone enclosed by tall buildings. I heard the door bang open behind me. Without hesitation, I sprinted again. The alley curved, leading to a main road if I followed it long enough. My legs burned from exhaustion, my chest ached, but the thought of him catching me was terrifying enough to keep me going. My day had gone from a late shift at work to the worst nightmare I could imagine, all in under an hour. As I reached the alley's mouth, I spotted a couple of parked lorries. Perhaps I could duck behind one, hide until he passed, but that might trap me if he noticed. Then I saw a police car drive by on the adjacent road. It was too far away for me to flag down from where I stood. The man emerged from the alleyway, scanning frantically until his eyes found me once more. I was done running. My entire body shook with exhaustion, but I mustered the last of my courage. I took a step back towards the alley, positioning myself so I could break into a run if he tried anything, but also hoping to draw him further out into the open where any random passerby or motorist might witness this nightmare. He advanced, chest heaving now, though he seemed more exhilarated than tired. His gaze flicked up and down the deserted street as if assessing his next move. "Why?" I managed to shout, tears burning at the corners of my eyes. My voice echoed in the silent space between buildings. He didn't answer. Instead, he lunged. I twisted away, his fingers grazing my arm. I stumbled and nearly fell, but I managed to keep my footing. Out of nowhere, a shout rang out behind me. A small group of bystanders had spotted the commotion, 2 men and a woman, possibly heading home from work or out for an evening meal. I saw one of them pull out a phone, presumably to ring the police. Another called out, "Oi, is everything all right?" That momentary distraction was all I needed. I scrambled away from my pursuer, darting toward the bystanders. He glanced at them, his eyes narrowing. Then, without warning, he turned and sprinted back down the alley. I collapsed onto the pavement, limbs trembling. The group rushed over, half carrying me to a nearby bench. I barely managed to get the words out, something about being chased, about him trying to catch me in the car park. One of the bystanders, a man with thick-framed glasses, phoned the police and explained what had happened as best he could. Another guided me to breathe slowly, urging me to calm down. We waited there, me wrapped in a borrowed coat, stammering details about his appearance, about how he'd followed me, and how my car wouldn't start. The woman next to me patted my shoulder gently, offering sips of water from a small bottle. I think I was in shock. My vision blurred at the edges, and I kept expecting him to leap out of the shadows any second. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only minutes, a patrol car arrived. I recounted the entire ordeal to the officers, the broken car, the unsettling grin, the chase through the car park and into the shop. The policeman asked if I'd ever seen him before, if there was any reason he might target me. I shook my head, swallowing the lump in my throat. I truly had no idea. The officers asked if I could show them where my car was. With the small group of good Samaritans offering me moral support, I led the police to the underground car park. My hands trembled the entire time. I half expected to see him lurking behind a pillar, but he was gone. When we reached my old battered car, it was exactly where I'd left it. The bonnet was cold. I tried the ignition again, but it still wouldn't start. One of the officers gave the engine a cursory look and suggested I call for a breakdown service. They also mentioned checking security cameras in the car park. I had a brief flutter of hope. Maybe they could identify him if he was caught on CCTV. That night I filed a police report. I didn't sleep well for weeks. In fact, I ended up taking taxis or the tube for a long time after that. My manager at work was surprisingly understanding, even letting me work from home for a few days so I could calm my nerves. I also started looking for a new place, somewhere with better security. That's how shaken I was. Though the police took my statement and said they'd keep an eye on the footage, I never heard any big breakthroughs. They followed up once, informing me that the camera angles in the car park were limited and that the chap's face wasn't clearly visible. He wore his collar up, apparently aware of where the cameras were located. As for the convenience shop, the cameras inside hadn't been functioning properly. Typical, right? Even now I sometimes wonder if he'd been watching me for days, figuring out my routine. My car's ignition problem might have saved my life, oddly enough. It forced me out of the vehicle into public view. If I'd driven off, who knows if he'd have followed me to a darker, emptier street. I moved into a new flat recently, one with a secure gate, well-lit hallways, and a guard on duty. I also started carrying pepper spray. Legal issues aside, I wanted something to protect myself. I still get nervous in underground car parks. My chest tightens, and I look over my shoulder far more often than I used to. I can't help it. That's my story. I'm sharing it because I hope it reminds people to stay alert, trust their instincts, and not brush off that prickle of unease. We're told so often to be polite, to assume the best of strangers, and normally that's sound advice. But sometimes politeness can be dangerous when it overrides your survival instincts. I'm just grateful I got away. I still get nightmares sometimes, dreams of a silent figure lurking by my car, refusing to speak, only smiling. If you ever find yourself alone in a quiet underground space and something feels wrong, please listen to that feeling. There's no harm in getting out of there fast or asking for help. Don't worry about looking foolish or paranoid. Your safety's worth infinitely more than a few awkward glances. Anyway, that's the story. It's taken me a while to share it here, but I suppose I wanted some closure. Maybe someone reading this will be more cautious with their parking choices or speak up if they see someone in distress. I know I've become more vigilant, and in a way that knowledge is the only good thing to come out of this entire horrible experience. I still live in Britain, but these days, I keep well away from dark corners whenever I can help it, and I check my back seat every time I get into my car, no matter how public the area. Perhaps that's a small price to pay for peace of mind. Stay safe, everyone, and thank you for letting me unburden myself. I've never been a big fan of offices that lock all the windows. There's something about sealed glass and recycled air that makes me feel like a lab rat. But 3 years ago, I was just another junior employee working in a 7-story building in central Birmingham, and I didn't have the luxury of complaining. Truthfully, I was grateful to have a job at all. Jobs in marketing don't exactly grow on trees, and I needed the money to help my mom pay off some medical bills after her hip surgery. I'm sharing this story now because the final court proceedings only concluded a few months back. Until then, I was advised not to speak about it online, but I've waited long enough, and I think people need to hear what happened. It's a story about how a routine day at work can transform into a paranoid, tension-filled nightmare when the threat you thought was gone manages to worm its way back in. I started at Linden and Cray Marketing right after university. I was young, ambitious, and keen to prove my worth. The building itself was modern, Lots of polished floors, glass walls, open-plan offices. We were on a busy high street, sharing real estate with cafes, bars, and a huge retail chain next door. It always felt like a prime, bustling urban location. In my second year with the company, we had a major incident. A senior data analyst named Hamish was caught embezzling client funds, or at least, that's what the rumors said. I never had the full story, just hushed gossip by the water cooler. Management sacked him on the spot. I still remember the day security escorted him out. He had this vacant look in his eyes, as if he couldn't believe the situation. He didn't resist, but something about the way he stared at everyone as he left made me shiver. That was the first time I realized that not all office drama ends with a friendly severance package. Some people nurse deep grudges long after they're kicked out. We all thought that was the end of it, though. Hamish was out, the funds were recovered, and the firm moved on. Or so we assumed. About a year later, everything changed again. By then, I'd been promoted from junior copywriter to content strategist, and I was working closely with a small group of colleagues. Danielle, my direct manager, Jacob, another strategist, and Aisha, our project coordinator. We'd formed a tight-knit team after pulling several late-nighters together to meet client deadlines. We trusted each other, or at least as much as you can trust coworkers in a cutthroat corporate environment. One morning, we arrived to find picket lines forming outside the building. Our company wasn't the target. Some labor union had orchestrated a citywide strike, protesting against job cuts in the retail sector. Because our offices were next to that massive retail store, the demonstration spilled over onto the pavements outside our main entrance. Chants echoed through the street, and a handful of protesters were even blocking the main doors, demanding that passers-by sign petitions. It was absolute chaos. We got an email from HR telling us to remain calm, continue our day as usual, and avoid engaging with the protesters. I remember thinking, that's easier said than done, because we could hear shouts and megaphone feedback through the windows, rattling our nerves. Some people just decided to work from home, but Danielle insisted we power through because we had an important client pitch that afternoon. I settled into my cubicle around 9 a.m., coffee in hand, half expecting the fire alarm to go off or something equally disruptive. The strike outside was in full swing, but I tried to tune it out. We had a pitch deck to finalize for a big automotive client. I booted up my computer only to discover that my files were missing. Everything I'd worked on the previous day had vanished. I did the usual panic routine, checked the recycle bin, combed through temporary folders, even tried a system restore. Nothing. Figuring it was a glitch in our shared drive, I asked Aisha if she could send me the backup. She started rummaging through her files, then froze. "All my Word documents are corrupted," she muttered. Jacob chimed in from across the desk. "Mine too. The folder structure is there, but I can't open anything." It wasn't just us. Around the office, people were whispering about vanished data, strange error messages, or files that appeared relabeled with nonsense names. Danielle called an emergency team huddle. We all filed into a small glass-walled conference room, and she gave us an update. The entire company network was experiencing a severe data breach. Our IT department suspected a hack or some malicious code infiltration. They told us to stay off our computers until further notice. We were panicking about the pitch, but Danielle tried to keep everyone calm. She reasoned that once IT got a handle on the situation, we'd retrieve our backups from the cloud. In the meantime, she suggested we reconstruct what we could from memory. All I could think was how our building's security protocols had always seemed ironclad. We had keycard entry on every floor, strict password policies, and a robust firewall. This kind of widespread sabotage didn't happen overnight. It had to be planned. An inside job, maybe. That's when I remembered Hamish. At first, the thought felt like a paranoid leap, but I couldn't shake the sense that he might be behind it. After all, he was the only ex-employee I knew who'd had serious issues with the firm. Then again, it might have been a competitor trying to cripple us. My mind was racing with possibilities. By lunchtime, the picket line outside had doubled in size, and the chanting was almost deafening, especially if you stood near the front doors. People in the office were getting restless. Some staff members left to join the protest. They claimed moral support, but I suspected they just wanted to skip work. Those of us left behind tried to salvage the day. Jacob poked his head into my cubicle. "I have a bad feeling about all this, mate. It's too targeted. The protest, the data breach. It's like someone's orchestrating chaos outside while messing with us inside. I nodded, glancing at the swirling mass of placards outside the window. Yeah, but we can't jump to conclusions. Could just be terrible timing. Still, we decided to do a bit of snooping. Danielle was in a meeting with IT. Aisha was scouring old email threads to see if any suspicious attachments had come through the pipeline. Jacob and I hopped onto a couple of spare laptops that were disconnected from the network, trying to see if we could glean anything from local copies of logs. We found references to an unfamiliar user ID that had logged in at odd hours over the past few weeks. The ID was HMX13. Hamish's initials were HM, but that felt too obvious. Then again, maybe he wanted us to notice. I scribbled down the details. We planned to show them to Danielle, but before we could, a loud crash from the corridor made us jump. We rushed out to find a rubbish bin knocked over. A couple of security guards were sprinting towards the back stairwell, walkie-talkies crackling. One shouted, "They've broken in!" My stomach lurched. Outside, the protest was rowdy but seemed largely peaceful. Inside, though, security had spotted a stranger in the restricted second-floor server room, someone wearing a high-visibility vest and a face mask. They'd disappeared by the time the guards arrived, leaving behind a shorted-out server rack and a strong smell of burnt plastic. The building's CCTV system had also gone offline. Chaos erupted. HR announced via the PA system that everyone should remain on their floors until further notice, effectively locking us in. People started muttering nervously, looking over their shoulders. Meanwhile, the chanting outside continued, as if taunting us. Danielle emerged from her meeting, face pale. She gathered our small team, me, Jacob, and Aisha, and led us into a corner of the break area. "Listen," she whispered. "It found evidence that someone's systematically destroying our data backups. We suspect the intruder is still in the building. Security is searching floor by floor, but the lifts keep glitching. The stairwells are locked from the ground up. Just stay put, all right? Let security do their job." Despite her instructions, we felt compelled to do more. We were the ones who had discovered the weird user logs, and we suspected Hamish's involvement. If he really was here, that meant he'd physically broken into the building at the same time our network got trashed. A pretty big leap for a disgruntled ex-employee, but not impossible. I remembered how he'd glared at everyone when security escorted him out a year ago, and a cold shiver swept across my skin. Let me backtrack for a moment. Right after Hamish was sacked, a few of us were interviewed by an external investigator hired by the company. We each gave our statements about what we knew. Truthfully, I didn't have much to contribute. I only interacted with Hamish a handful of times. But Danielle mentioned he'd left behind cryptic messages and code, lines of script that seemed harmless at first but later turned out to be part of a larger system override. The investigators concluded he'd planned to embezzle money by rerouting digital transactions. He even wrote letters to some senior managers afterwards, insisting he was innocent and that the real culprit had framed him. No one believed him. As the months passed, we forgot about Hamish. Then rumors started surfacing. He was spotted in the local area, hanging around the building, or that he'd posted vague threats on social media. The stories never led anywhere concrete. But seeing the chaos unfolding now, it felt like that past threat was back, this time in full force. We were told to stay on our floor, but nerves got the better of us. Our small group decided to try and find the intruder ourselves, or at least see if we could gather evidence. In hindsight, that was a stupid idea. We were marketing people, not security experts. But adrenaline and fear push you to do rash things. Aisha suggested checking the IT department on the third floor. If the intruder was messing with servers, maybe that's where we'd find more clues. We made our way upstairs using our access cards. The corridor lights flickered as if someone was messing with the building's electrical systems. My heart thudded in my chest. The office space up there was eerily quiet. Desks were empty, computers off. We peeked into the server room, expecting the worst. Wires dangled from the racks, and an acrid smell lingered. But no one was there. Jacob carefully stepped inside, phone torch in hand, scanning the corners. Then we spotted another set of footprints. Someone had tracked muddy footprints from the stairwell. They led further into a side corridor. We followed, trembling with each step. It felt like a horror film cliché. Never split up, never follow weird footprints. But we pressed on. At the end of the corridor was a locked door marked Server Control Authorized Personnel Only. Our pass cards didn't work. A beep sounded, then an automated voice. Access denied. Danielle exhaled softly. If they're in there, we need security to break it down. She glanced at Aisha. Try calling them. Aisha dialed the security desk on her mobile, but the call wouldn't connect. Either the lines were jammed by the protest outside, or someone was deliberately blocking our signals. We retreated, frustration mounting. That's when the corridor lights flickered again, plunging us into momentary darkness. A swirl of panic flared in my gut. We stumbled back to the staircase only to find the door jammed. It clicked, but wouldn't open. Trapped on the third floor, we exchanged tense glances. This was no accidental glitch. Someone was controlling the building systems, locking us in. I couldn't help but picture Hamish cackling behind a screen somewhere, flicking switches to torment us. Jacob fiddled with the door handle, muttering curses under his breath. Aisha tried the IT support line again, voicemail. Danielle paced, her eyes darting nervously. I tried to keep a level head, remembering my old self-defense lessons from university. They mostly taught me how to handle physical threats, not how to outsmart a sabotage from within. Suddenly, a faint static crackle echoed from the overhead speakers. Then, an unfamiliar voice spoke. All staff, attention. This building is compromised. Evacuate immediately. A pause, then the same message repeated. The voice had a metallic echo to it, like it was synthesized, but the words "evacuate immediately" set alarm bells ringing. Were we really supposed to flee into the street, where a massive strike was still raging? The building was on partial lockdown, so how would we even get out? Danielle tried to calm us. This could be a ploy to create panic. Let's think logically. Yet a kernel of truth in that announcement stuck with me. Maybe the saboteur wanted everyone out so they could cause more damage without bystanders. Or maybe they planned to ambush us in the stairwells. My mind spun with worst-case scenarios. Let me skip ahead an hour or so. Security eventually forced open the stairwell doors on the upper floors, sweeping through with torches. They found us huddled near the locked door to the server control room. After confirming our identities, they escorted us down to the lobby. That's when we saw the aftermath of the intrusion. The ground floor was a wreck, computers smashed, cables pulled from the reception desk, and even the big LED sign above the entrance had been shattered. Outside, the protesters were still chanting, oblivious to what was happening inside. The police had arrived by then, forming a cordon that stretched across the pavement. 2 uniformed officers were questioning staff members who had evacuated. We gave them our accounts of the day's events, describing the masked figure and the sabotage. They took our statements, and we heard that the CCTV had been looped with old footage, so they had no real-time recordings of the intruder. Jacob told the police about the suspicious user ID, HMX13. I was half expecting them to laugh at us, but they took it seriously. They said a special cybercrime unit would investigate. For the moment, the entire building was deemed a crime scene. We were sent home, told to stay reachable in case the police needed more information. Over the next few days, we tried to carry on, working remotely while IT specialists assessed the damage. We heard rumors that massive amounts of client data had been encrypted or wiped. Our boss, Mr. Friedman, assured us that the backups were safe in an off-site location. But we knew someone had gone to great lengths to break into the building, probably to destroy or steal that off-site backup as well. One evening, Jacob and I received a text message from a burner number. I only wanted the truth. Now you leave me no choice. We shared it with each other immediately, realizing we'd both got the exact same message, word for word. The signature read, H. That was enough to confirm our worst suspicion. Hamish was behind it. The next day, Danielle got the same text. We called the police again, forwarding the messages. They told us Hamish was officially wanted for questioning, but that they hadn't located him. They suggested we stay vigilant, possibly change our daily routines. I started checking over my shoulder whenever I left the flat. Aisha went to stay with her sister in Wolverhampton. Jacob crashed on my sofa a few nights, worried about being alone. The tension was palpable, like we were all living on borrowed time. About a week later, the police discovered evidence linking Hamish to the infiltration. They found code fragments on a laptop seized from a storage unit rented in his name. The code matched what had been used to sabotage our office. They also uncovered old emails indicating Hamish believed he was framed for the original embezzlement. He was determined to expose the real culprit, presumably a higher-up in our company, and he wanted revenge for his firing. We were caught in the crossfire since we discovered the user logs and tried to stop him. I felt a mix of fear and pity. If Hamish was truly innocent back then, why not go through legal channels? But maybe he'd tried and failed. I still don't know the entire truth about his innocence or guilt. All I know is that his vendetta escalated into a full-scale attack on the company. Eventually, the building reopened with beefed-up security and partial restoration of our data systems. We returned to work under heavy watch. Police were patrolling the lobby, camera crews were outside, and the citywide strike had fizzled. Tensions remained high, though. Our small team stuck together trying to keep morale afloat. It was on a Thursday morning, almost 2 weeks after the infiltration, that everything boiled over. We were in a glass meeting room on the 5th floor, discussing our new client strategy. Suddenly, an alarm blared through the corridors. This time, it wasn't a glitch or a hoax. The building's emergency lockdown system engaged, sealing the exits. The overhead lights pulsed red, and a computerized voice repeated, "Security breach detected. Please remain where you are." Danielle jumped up. "We have to find a secure place. This floor is too exposed." We grabbed our phones, but the cellular network was jammed again. Just then, we heard a chilling clang, like someone forcing a metal door open on the far side of the corridor. Jacob risked a peek outside the meeting room. He jerked back, eyes wide. "He's here. Hamish. I'm sure of it. I saw his face for half a second. He's got some sort of crowbar." My stomach twisted. All those months of dread culminating in this moment. We locked the meeting room door from the inside, huddling together. Aisha's hands were shaking. Danielle tried to call building security on the landline, but all she got was static. For a few long minutes, we heard nothing but the wail of the alarm. Then footsteps, measured, purposeful. A figure passed by the glass wall. He wore a dark jacket, hood pulled over his head, face covered by a black surgical mask. I only saw his eyes. Cold, determined. He rapped on the glass with the crowbar, a mocking gesture that left my blood running cold. We backed away. The glass was supposedly reinforced, but I wasn't certain it could withstand repeated blows. My heart pounded as I clutched my phone, desperate for a signal. Then a voice boomed down the corridor. "Armed police, drop your weapon!" In a flash, Hamish darted out of sight. A thunderous commotion followed, shouts, scuffling. A sharp crack I later realized was a taser. Jacob and I pressed our faces to the glass wall, struggling to see. About half a dozen armed officers in tactical gear had stormed the floor, cornering Hamish near the lifts. He slumped to his knees, the crowbar clattering to the ground. We could hardly believe it. External intervention had arrived in the nick of time. The lockdown system had alerted the authorities once the intrusion was detected. They must have been on high alert after the previous break-in and the threats. We watched, breathless, as they apprehended him. A paramedic unit arrived moments later, presumably to check if he was injured. For a long time, we just stood there, trembling with adrenaline. It was over, or so we hoped. The police escorted us out of the building once it was secure. Journalists clamored for statements, but we had none to give. We were too stunned. Over the next few weeks, the story hit local news. Disgruntled ex-employee arrested after office infiltration. People at neighboring businesses were shocked to learn how close the situation came to tragedy. It turned out that Hamish had been lurking in the area for days, waiting for the right moment. The citywide strike provided cover for his first break-in, and the second attempt was his last-ditch effort to retrieve or destroy more incriminating data. He believed if he found the files proving his innocence, he could blackmail the firm. Instead, he ended up facing multiple charges: trespass, vandalism, cybercrime offenses, assault with a deadly weapon, you name it. Danielle, Jacob, Aisha, and I testified in court. It was surreal, seeing him in the dock, his once blank expression now replaced by fury and desperation. He insisted we were all complicit in a conspiracy to frame him. I felt pity, but also relief that he was finally being dealt with by the proper authorities. The jury didn't buy his story. He was convicted. In the months following, our company overhauled its security infrastructure, both digital and physical. Mr. Friedman assured investors that everything was under control, but morale took a long time to recover. Some employees left, unsettled by how vulnerable we'd been. Danielle received counseling through the firm's health plan. Jacob and I both started sleeping with phone alarms by our bedsides, just in case. Aisha developed a habit of triple-checking every locked door she passed. I still work at Linden & Cray, believe it or not. I got a promotion last year, partly due to the resilience we showed during the crisis. Sometimes when I'm alone in the lift, I recall Hamish's eyes glaring through the glass, a ghost of a memory that keeps me vigilant. We never did discover if there was an actual higher-up framing him from the start. Perhaps he was guilty all along, or maybe he was just a scapegoat who lost his mind seeking revenge. Either way, I've learned to be cautious about secrets in corporate worlds. They can fester and grow into something truly dangerous. Why I'm sharing. Now that Hamish's appeals have been exhausted and the final court proceedings are done, I feel I can safely tell this story. My hope is that people in office environments take note. Disgruntled employees aren't always satisfied with simply walking away. If someone believes they've been wronged, they might come back for revenge in ways you can't predict, especially if they have the technical know-how to exploit vulnerabilities in your systems. I also want to give credit to the West Midlands Police for intervening before anyone got seriously hurt. We got lucky. Had they arrived even a few minutes later, who knows how the confrontation would have ended. The memory of that crowbar scraping against glass will probably haunt me for years. To this day, our small group, me, Danielle, Jacob, and Aisha, still share a group chat called The Survivors, where we occasionally post updates about random office drama or just check in on each other's well-being. We joke that we've been through a corporate horror film together. In truth, we have. The only difference is, we didn't have the luxury of turning it off when it got too intense. So, that's the full account of what happened. If you're ever working in a seemingly secure office environment, don't assume the locked windows and keycard doors make you immune to threats. Sometimes danger comes from someone who knows the system as intimately as you do. Someone determined, patient, and convinced they've been wronged. My advice? Never ignore the red flags. And if a colleague gets escorted out under a cloud of controversy, maybe keep an eye on those logs for any mysterious user IDs. Trust me, it might save you a terrifying day, or two, of living through your very own corporate horror story. I never thought I'd share this experience, but the nightmares haven't eased, and writing everything down might help me cope. I'm posting this from my flat in London where I've been holed up for days, taking sick leave from work because I just can't face going outside. Every time I try, I feel my heart racing, palms sweating, and my mind conjures awful memories of what happened a couple of weeks ago. I guess I'm hoping that if even one person reads this and understands, or learns from it, it'll be worth reliving those dreadful moments. I'd just finished an exhausting day at my marketing job, which is quite a commute from my new place. I'd only moved to London 2 months earlier, chasing a promotion I'd been offered. I've always considered myself fairly streetwise. I grew up in a tough neighborhood, had plenty of self-defense training after a mugging incident when I was a teenager, and I'm pretty aware of my surroundings. Or so I thought. That day, I left the office at around 5:30 in the evening, hoping to beat the worst of rush hour. We'd had a last-minute meeting that ran long. By the time I finally clocked off, the sun was dipping and people were pouring onto the streets. My usual routine involves taking the bus or the tube, depending on how tired I am or how heavy my laptop bag feels. That evening, my back was killing me, so I decided to drive. The building where I work doesn't have its own car park, so I use this massive multi-level underground parking structure a few streets away. It's a bit sketchy, especially at night, but it's cheap compared to anything else in central London. Normally, I'm not one to be easily spooked. I've wandered around dark alleys in my teens, part of a youth group where we do nighttime charity events. But the silence down there always unnerves me, even when it's filled with cars. I remember descending the ramp into the underground parking. It was around 6:30 by then, and rush hour in London is absolute madness. Horns blaring, people shouting at each other, endless queues everywhere. I was beyond relieved to break away from the chaos above ground once I'd found my entrance. The parking area was significantly cooler than the streets. The fluorescent lights overhead gave off this annoying buzzing sound, and they flickered in a few spots, creating pockets of gloom. I spotted my little second-hand hatchback on level B2, where I usually leave it. Barely anyone else was around at that point. Most people had already left work at a more reasonable hour. I walked past a row of cars, my footsteps echoing in the emptiness. I could see my car about 20 meters ahead. My phone buzzed with a text from my mom. She's always checking in on me, especially since my big move. I typed back a quick reply, something like, "I'm fine, just heading home now, chat later." Then I slipped my phone into my jacket pocket and fished for my keys. That's when I heard another set of footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, not the confident stride of someone going to their own car. More like someone was pacing themselves to match my speed. I glanced around, a bit unsettled, but I saw no one in immediate view. The place echoed so much, it was hard to tell exactly where the sound came from. I told myself it was just my imagination amplifying some random noise. Still, my instincts nagged. I hurried my pace a little, keys clenched in my hand. Finally, I reached my hatchback, popped the boot, and tossed my laptop bag inside. Then I slid into the driver's seat and locked the doors straight away, something I'd picked up as a habit after that teenage mugging. It was a simple routine that had always made me feel safe. I stuck the key in the ignition and turned. Nothing, not even a hint of the engine trying. I tried again, desperately pumping the accelerator like that would do something. Still silence. I'll admit, I let out a frustrated groan. Of all times for my ancient car to decide it was done, it had to be in a dimly lit underground level after a long day, when the last thing I wanted was to ring up a tow service. My phone battery was okay. I wasn't one of those "my phone always dies" types. So I texted my mate Dan, who's good with cars, to see if he had any quick suggestions before I called for roadside assistance. He sent a few tips. Check the battery connections, give the engine a break for a minute, try the ignition again. I tried everything, but it was obviously beyond a quick fix. I was about to ring the tow people when I caught movement in my rearview mirror. A person stepped out from behind a concrete pillar. At first, I just thought it was some random driver. I figured they might be heading to their own car. But they paused the moment they saw me looking. Their face was cast in shadow, so I couldn't make out any features. Something about the way they stood there, head angled slightly to one side, felt all wrong. My stomach twisted into knots. Usually people walk normally, rummage for their keys, or do something that indicates they have a normal reason to be in a car park. This figure just hovered in my blind spot, hands by their sides. I told myself to stay calm. I decided to roll the window down just a crack and call out politely, "Excuse me? Do you know if there's a jump start service around here?" My voice echoed, but they didn't reply. They didn't even flinch. They just inched a bit closer, staying partly behind that pillar. My heart started pounding. Everything in my training, my self-defense classes, told me to get out of there, but the car wasn't cooperating. I locked my doors. They were already locked, but I double-checked. Then I grabbed my phone again. My hands trembled as I tried to search for an emergency breakdown service. Suddenly, there was this thud on the back of my car. I jolted in my seat and spun around. The person had slammed a hand on the boot, like they were testing how I might react. My heart was hammering so loud I thought they could probably hear it from outside. "Look," I yelled, trying to sound braver than I felt. "I'm calling the police." My voice cracked a bit. No response. Instead, they circled around to the passenger side. The windows were tinted, so maybe they couldn't see me clearly, but I could see the silhouette. As they neared the passenger door, I held my breath, certain they were about to try the handle. But they didn't. They just stood there. Every horror story I've ever read online came crashing into my mind. You know how people always say, "Just drive away." But obviously, my car was dead. The next suggestion is, run for it. But I didn't know if there were others lurking behind pillars, or if this was some twisted setup to corner me. Also, the exit ramps are quite a trek, and that would mean turning my back on this person. I'd learned never to show your back in a threatening situation if you can help it. I held up my phone, waved it as if to say, "I'm on a call," hoping that'd scare them off. They retreated a few steps, but then started to circle the car again. That was it. My terror overcame me, and I dialed the emergency services. I tried to explain my situation, though I sounded half hysterical. The operator kept calm, but I could sense they weren't entirely convinced that this was a full-on emergency. "We'll send someone out," they said, "but it might take some time due to heavy traffic." Typical London emergency backlog. They advised me to remain calm, keep my doors locked, and try to get to a populated area if possible. Populated area? I was on level B2 of a half-deserted car park. My only chance was to get out on foot and rush to the nearest lift or stairwell. Maybe I could find a security guard or a kiosk up top. Summoning whatever courage I had left, I grabbed my laptop bag, felt better having the weight of something I could swing if needed, slid it over my shoulder, and prepared myself to open the door. I left most of my personal items behind, hoping that if they wanted to rob me, they'd just grab the car or rummage through it. My priority was getting away, not my stuff. I cracked the door open a fraction, scanning the area. For a moment I didn't see them. Maybe they'd gone, or maybe they were behind a pillar. I stepped out slowly, keys in one hand, phone in the other, bag strapped securely. My footsteps echoed as I crept across the oil-stained concrete. I headed towards the nearest exit sign. That was about 10 meters away. Each step felt like a marathon. My breath sounded unnaturally loud to me, and I swore my heart was going to give me away. Halfway there, I heard a scraping sound behind me. Spinning around, I saw the figure again, stepping out from behind another pillar. This time, I got a better glimpse. They wore dark trousers, scuffed trainers, a black hoodie with the hood pulled low. I still couldn't see their face, but I sensed a grin, or maybe that was my imagination. They took a slow step towards me. I panicked. I bolted for the exit sign, the rubber soles of my shoes squealing on the concrete. I heard footsteps behind me, quick and purposeful. The corridor leading to the stairs was in sight. I dashed in, slamming the metal door behind me. It had a handle on the inside, so I yanked it, hoping it would lock. But it was one of those push-bar type doors from the inside. It wouldn't hold if they followed. I took the stairs two at a time, panting. My mind raced. Was there a security guard at the top? CCTV cameras? I reached the ground-level exit, only to find it was locked from the outside. Usually you can enter from street level if you've got a parking ticket, but it seemed after a certain hour they secured it, forcing you to exit through the front kiosk. I was stuck in this narrow stairwell, trying to figure out my next move. Then I heard the door below slam open. Heavy steps on the stairs. Closer, closer. The lighting in the stairwell was even worse. Most bulbs seemed half burnt out. I spotted a sign. Lift, this way. I dashed through another narrow corridor, found the lift doors, and frantically mashed the up button. Nothing. No light. Possibly turned off after hours. Or maybe it was broken. I heard the steps approach the corridor. My body was on full alert, adrenaline pulsing. I didn't want to be cornered by a lift that might not even work. So I carried on, searching for a second staircase or some other exit. Then I heard a voice. It was low, distorted. Could have been a woman or a man. I couldn't tell. They whispered something like, "Stop running." I froze for half a second, fear gripping me. Why would they say that? What did they want? Robbery? Worse? I forced myself to move again, ignoring the burning in my thighs and calves from sprinting up the steps. I found a metal door that said level B1. That would be closer to the street. Maybe I could slip out. As soon as I stepped onto level B1, I nearly bumped into a parked van. I noticed a few more cars here, perhaps a handful of stragglers. The lighting was marginally better, but the place was still mostly deserted. I figured if I got to the street ramp, I might catch the attention of passing drivers. I began weaving between vehicles, searching for the ramp. I caught a glimpse of the figure stepping onto B1 from the same door I used. No chance to hide properly. They were scanning the area, head turning in a slow arc. I crouched between two large 4x4s, trying to steady my breathing. My phone felt like dead weight in my pocket. I should have rung the operator back, but I was afraid that any noise, any light from the screen, would reveal my location. My heart pounded so violently I worried they'd hear it. Then beyond the 4x4, I saw them again, gliding almost noiselessly across the concrete. They paused by each car, occasionally peering into windows. They were hunting me. This was no random intimidation. They wanted me, specifically. The realization chilled me to the core. At that moment, I remembered my self-defense training. The instructors always said, if you can run, run. If you can't, fight like your life depends on it. I clutched my keys between my fingers, forming a makeshift weapon. I had no illusions about my strength compared to a potentially armed attacker, but I wasn't going down without a fight. Summoning a surge of bravery, I decided to break cover and sprint for the ramp. If I could just get onto the street, even if the figure followed, there'd be more people, more witnesses, more help. I threw myself forward, shoes pounding the concrete. Almost immediately, they spotted me and gave chase. The ramp was maybe 20 meters ahead, curving upwards. My lungs burned, but I pushed on. Just as I rounded a parked SUV, they caught up to me. An iron grip latched onto my jacket, yanking me backward. I spun, swiping with my keys. I caught the sleeve of their hoodie, and I might have grazed their arm. They hissed in pain or surprise, but they didn't let go. I was about to scream for help when a hand slammed over my mouth, muffling my voice. My phone clattered to the ground. I kicked backward with my heel, connecting with their shin. They loosened their hold enough for me to twist away, keys still clenched in my fist. I turned, eyes darting around for anything I could use as a better weapon. I saw a long metal rod near some construction materials, but it was several steps away. The figure lunged at me again. I managed to swing my laptop bag this time, smashing it into their shoulder. They stumbled back slightly, probably not expecting me to fight so hard. My heart was in my throat. I'd never been so scared. We stood there in a weird standoff for a few seconds. I could feel the adrenaline making my hands shake uncontrollably. They had their fists up, clearly prepared to keep coming. I was breathing in shallow, ragged gasps, the metallic taste of fear coating my tongue. I didn't know what else to do but scream, "Help! Someone help me!" My voice echoed off the concrete walls, but I got no response. They charged again, and this time I slashed out with the keys, aiming for their face. I must have caught some part of their cheek or brow because they stumbled back with a guttural sound. Blood dripped onto the concrete. I took my chance, darting around them towards the ramp. They tried to grab me again, but caught only the edge of my bag. I wriggled free and sprinted up the ramp so fast I thought my lungs would burst. The ramp led out onto a side street. Traffic was thick but slow-moving, typical rush hour jam, except it was now later in the evening, so maybe it was after rush. Still, there were enough headlights and pedestrians that I felt safer. I dashed into the street, practically into the path of a black cab. The driver slammed the brakes, horn blaring at me. I stumbled onto the pavement, scanning behind me. The figure lingered at the mouth of the ramp, just out of sight, probably not wanting to be seen by so many witnesses. I collapsed onto a bench nearby, doubled over in exhaustion, tears streaming down my face. People on the pavement gave me strange looks. Maybe they thought I was drunk or having a breakdown. A couple of them kept their distance, obviously hesitant. I tried to explain, someone attacked me, down there. But in the city, especially in a hectic area, a crying person might not get immediate help. I pulled out my phone and realized I'd dropped it in the car park. I was about to beg a passerby to lend me theirs when two uniformed officers appeared. Someone must have reported the screaming or the scuffle in the street. Relief flooded me. I babbled out the entire story, pointing wildly at the ramp. They immediately called for backup, and I heard them radio in the location. They led me to their patrol car to calm me down and ask some standard questions. Did I know my attacker? Had they robbed me, etc.? I kept saying, I've no idea who it was, and that I believed they were still in the underground parking. Additional units arrived, though by the time they searched the structure, it seemed empty. No sign of the figure, no sign of forced entry on other cars. One of the officers walked me to my car on level B2. Sure enough, it was still dead as a doornail. The policeman mentioned that my battery cables looked badly corroded. It might have just been a coincidence that the car died at that moment. Or maybe the person had messed with them, though we found no definitive proof. I was trembling the entire time, glancing around every pillar and corner. They ended up calling a recovery lorry to help with my car, which was eventually towed to a garage. The police took a statement, but I could tell they doubted they'd find the attacker. CCTV in that old parking structure was notoriously poor, and it turned out some cameras had been vandalized recently. In the aftermath, I filed a police report. I spent the night at a friend's place because I was too shaken to return to my own. The next day, I went to the station to see if there were any updates. There weren't. They couldn't identify the suspect from my description. A person in a dark hoodie wasn't much to go on, especially in central London. One officer did mention they found some droplets of blood on level B1, presumably from when I slashed the attacker's face with my keys. But without a suspect or further evidence, it's unlikely to go anywhere. It's been a fortnight since then. I've hardly slept. My new job has been understanding, but I can tell they're starting to wonder if I'm taking advantage of the situation. I've had to explain the situation in broad strokes, but not the full horror, obviously. My mother's worried sick. My friend Dan's been checking in every day, offering to drive me around so I don't have to face another car park. I've started taking cabs to therapy sessions. Yes, I decided to start therapy. Flashbacks, panic attacks, feeling paranoid whenever I'm in an enclosed space. It's no way to live. I keep replaying that moment in the underground parking, wondering if there was something I could have done differently. Was I targeted or was it random? The figure's behavior felt personal, like they knew how to corner me, how to scare me. It's made me question everything, my so-called street smarts, my instincts, my independence. If I'd left the office a bit earlier or later, if I'd caught the bus, if I'd chosen a different car park. But those thoughts just drive me mad. For now, I've arranged a safer parking space in a more secure building, albeit at a higher cost. I've gone back to carrying pepper spray, which is a gray area legally, but I'd rather be safe than sorry. My friend brought it from a trip abroad, not exactly kosher, but I'm desperate. I also keep a personal alarm on me. I've changed my routine so I don't leave work so late if I can help it. My manager's been flexible, letting me shift my hours a bit. I know none of these measures guarantee my safety, but they help me feel slightly less vulnerable. I'm sharing this here now because people need to know that danger can strike in the most mundane moments, like an ordinary Tuesday after work in a place you've parked 100 times. It doesn't have to be midnight in a dark alley. And if anyone else has had a similar experience in an underground car park in London, especially near Moorgate, please speak up. Maybe we can find some pattern, or maybe I'll discover I'm not alone in facing this. I'm also writing it out because the nightmares are intense. I wake up in a cold sweat, hearing those echoing footsteps in my mind, that whisper telling me to stop running. I feel like if I keep this bottled up, it'll haunt me forever. At least, by putting it out there, I'm not suffering in silence. And if you're reading this, please be careful out there. Even if you think you're prepared, if you think you know self-defense, if you think you're too aware to be caught off guard, stay vigilant. Danger can come out of nowhere. I was lucky enough to escape, though I still wonder if I was truly lucky, or if the attacker just let me go in the end. The final image I have is of that figure standing at the entrance to the ramp, half in shadow, almost like they were disappointed I'd reached the crowds. Maybe they'll try it again on someone else. That thought keeps me up at night more than anything. So if you're in a situation like that, don't hesitate. Scream, fight, run. Do anything you can. And above all, trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is. That's my story. I'm still shaking typing these last lines. I hope no one else has to go through something like it. But if you do, there is a way out, and sometimes sheer willpower and a bit of luck can make the difference. Stay safe, everyone. I never want to see a concrete pillar or hear the flicker of fluorescent lights again, but I'm determined to keep living my life no matter how many nightmares come my way. I'm writing this down because I still can't shake off the dread that's been following me around ever since our so-called relaxing holiday turned into a waking nightmare. My counselor suggested that sharing it might help me make sense of what happened, so here goes. If someone had told me a month ago that I'd be terrified of going into the woods again, on a bright sunny day no less, I would have scoffed. I've always been the outdoorsy one in my circle. I love hiking, wild camping, sleeping under the stars. My mate Nadia and I have done more nature treks than I can count, from the Lake District to Snowdonia. But nothing ever prepared us for what went down on our last trip. We planned this holiday as a break from city life. Nadia was stressed at her nursing job. I just wrapped up a huge project at work. We decided a few days of camping in a remote forest in the Peak District would be the perfect reset button for both of us. We found a spot that was off the usual tourist track, the sort of place you only hear about through word of mouth. It promised tranquility, natural springs, loads of wildlife. I was thrilled. We left on a Friday morning. The sun was already beaming and it felt like the hottest day of the year. The forecast was for a mini heat wave, high 20s, which for Britain might as well be the Sahara. But we didn't mind. We packed extra water and wore light hiking gear. Nadia, bless her, insisted on bringing a solar-powered fan she found online, convinced it would keep us from roasting in the tent. I teased her for being overly cautious, but she just gave me this wry look. She's from a cooler climate originally and hates being too hot. We arrived at the forest entrance around midday. The drive was uneventful, just miles of motorway, then smaller winding roads that seemed to get narrower the further we went. By the time we got to the little lay-by where we were to park, there were no other cars around. Perfect, we thought. We heaved our rucksacks on and started down the trail. It was bright out, no sense of looming darkness or anything. Yet I remember pausing at the tree line. The forest looked denser than I'd expected, the canopy lush and nearly impenetrable. I felt a slight flutter of nerves but shrugged it off as excitement. The trail itself wasn't particularly challenging, just a bit overgrown in places. We followed the directions from a friend of mine who'd been here last summer. Along the way, we chatted about everything. Nadia's shift patterns, the insane rent in London, my big career shift. We were thoroughly enjoying each other's company, that giddy sense of freedom that comes when you're about to drop off the grid for a while. I can't pin down the exact moment things started to feel off. Maybe it was when we passed a large oak with a peculiar carving on its trunk. It looked like a face, though quite weathered. Nadia joked that it was some druid symbol, but there was an edge to her laugh, a bit forced. The deeper we went, the quieter the woods seemed to become. No birdsong, no rustling of squirrels, just the crunch of our boots and our labored breathing in the sticky heat. We reached the clearing mid-afternoon. It was exactly as my friend had described, a small patch of flat ground, bounded by ancient trees, with a trickle of a stream a little ways off. We set up our tents side by side, hammered in the pegs, sorted out our sleeping gear. By then, we were exhausted and sweaty, so we decided to find the stream and splash some water on our faces. The water felt gloriously cool on my skin, though I noticed it ran quite shallow. Another sign of the heat wave, I supposed. After we freshened up, we returned to our campsite to fix an early dinner. That's when we realized there was no phone signal at all. I'd half expected that, given how remote we were. Nadia tried to stand on a stump, waving her phone about. No luck. I guess we're properly off-grid, she said. We'd planned to switch off from social media anyway, so it didn't bother us much. We ate, cleaned up, then lounged around, watching the sunlight shift through the canopy. Around 6 or 7, we heard a branch snap in the distance. I remember us pausing mid-conversation, thinking it could be a deer or a fox. We waited, expecting more sounds of wildlife, but nothing came. Nadia shrugged it off, telling me not to be jumpy. So we went on chatting, eventually turning in early because the heat had sapped our energy. That first night, I had the strangest dream. I heard footsteps circling our tents, but in the dream, the footsteps were impossibly slow, like whoever was out there wanted me to know they were near. When I woke up, heart pounding, it was the dead of night, and everything was quiet. I peeked out of my tent and saw only darkness. I told myself it was a bad dream, maybe triggered by the hush of the forest. I managed to fall back asleep until dawn. We spent most of the next day exploring. Nadia loves to identify wild plants, so she was in her element, stopping every few meters to check leaves and flowers. The sun was relentless, beating down through gaps in the canopy. We were sweating buckets, but the occasional breeze helped. We climbed over a few fallen logs, crossed the stream a couple of times, and basically got lost in conversation. It was so peaceful, so isolated, that I almost forgot my uneasy dream. Late that afternoon, we came across something odd. It looked like a little arrangement of stones near the base of a tree, almost forming a circle. In the middle were small bones, animal bones, maybe a rabbit or a bird, but they were arranged in a deliberate pattern. We stared at it for a moment, exchanging uneasy glances. "This is creeping me out," Nadia said. I tried to make a joke about forest folk rituals, but my voice sounded hollow. We decided to head back to camp. We were both feeling uneasy, though neither of us admitted it aloud. We had a quiet dinner again, barely chatting, as though each of us was lost in thought. By dusk, the temperature finally dropped a bit, so we decided to take advantage of the cooler air and roam just outside our clearing to gather more kindling. Nadia wandered off to the left while I wandered off to the right. I could still see her bright orange top through the trees, so it didn't feel dangerous. At some point, I heard her shout, "Hey, come see this!" I jogged over, expecting to find maybe some interesting rock formation or a hidden pond. Instead, Nadia stood by a large tree, staring at something carved into its bark. It was a rough spiral shape with lines cutting through it. Could have been graffiti or some obscure symbol. I reached out to touch it, running my fingers over the grooves. It didn't look that old, maybe a year or so. It gave me an odd chill. "Let's just go back," Nadia said, her voice tight. We grabbed our kindling and made our way to camp, throwing nervous glances behind us. That night was worse than the first. I woke again to hear movement, only this time it was definitely not a dream. Dry leaves crackled outside my tent. My heart felt like it was trying to punch through my ribcage. I whispered, "Nadia?" But her tent was silent a few feet away. The crackling continued, then stopped abruptly. I reached for my torch, trying to steady my shaking hand. I contemplated unzipping my tent to look, but the fear pinned me down. I was too terrified that I'd come face to face with someone, or something, I didn't want to see. Eventually I must have dozed off again. In the morning light, everything seemed less frightening. Nadia was already awake when I emerged. She looked frazzled, dark circles under her eyes. "You hear that last night?" I asked. She nodded, then told me she'd heard whispering. She couldn't make out words, just a low, breathy murmur. "Could be wind in the branches," I offered, but she shook her head. It sounded like a person. After breakfast, we searched around our tents. That's when we noticed footprints, human footprints, pressed into the dirt. Not ours, too big for Nadia's feet, slightly bigger than mine. They circled around the tents. My stomach clenched. Why would anyone wander around a random campsite in the middle of nowhere at night, not announcing themselves? We decided maybe we'd been unlucky and camped near some strange local who got their kicks scaring people. Nadia was all for packing up and leaving, but I convinced her we should stay one more day, see if maybe it was just a hiker passing by. I regretted it almost immediately, but my pride kicked in. I'd chosen this spot, recommended it to her. I didn't want to bail without giving it a proper chance. That afternoon was scorching. We took a short hike to get phone signal, but no matter how far we climbed, our phones stayed lifeless in that regard. We found a vantage point looking over the valley, stunning views, bright sunshine, and took a few pictures. For a while, it felt like we were just on a normal holiday. I remember laughing with Nadia about some silly college memory. We nearly convinced ourselves that the footprints were just a coincidence. But on our way back to camp, that uneasy feeling crept up again. We both kept glancing over our shoulders. The forest was so quiet, no bird song, no rustling. It was unnatural. Every step sounded too loud. The sun was still high, this was definitely daytime, but the trees felt oppressive, as if they were closing in. About half a mile from camp, we heard a sharp crack, like a branch snapping underfoot. We froze, staring into the foliage. Nothing moved. We scanned the area for a minute before hurrying on, hearts pounding. When we got back, we found something that destroyed any sense of calm we'd been clinging to. Our tents, which we'd zipped up to keep out insects, had their flaps wide open. Inside Nadia's tent, her sleeping bag was dragged halfway out, as if rummaged through. My rucksack was tipped over, some of my clothes scattered. Nothing seemed obviously stolen, but it was clear someone had gone through our stuff. We circled the area, calling out, "Hello, who's there?" No reply. We were properly on edge now. Nadia's hands were shaking as she gathered her belongings. "We have to leave," she kept saying. I couldn't disagree. We started stuffing everything into our bags as fast as we could. That's when we heard footsteps, bold, deliberate footsteps, right at the edge of the clearing. I spun around, heart in my throat. I couldn't see anyone, but I heard them. Leaves crunching, a branch or two snapping. It sounded close. I shouted, "Who's there? We're leaving, all right?" There was a slight pause, then the footsteps retreated. We crammed our gear into our bags in record time, no thought for neatness. The whole time, I felt eyes on us. It was bright day, the sun glaring through the gaps in the canopy, but I'd never felt so exposed. We set off in the direction of the lay-by, determined to get back to the car. Our pace was fast, borderline frantic, even with our heavy loads. Every so often, we'd hear a twig snap behind us or catch a flash of movement in our peripheral vision. Once I glanced over my shoulder and saw a shape dart behind a thick trunk, possibly a person in dark clothing, but it happened so quickly I couldn't be sure. We sped up, ignoring the sweat pouring down our backs, ignoring the thirst that parched our throats. The path felt twisted, like it had grown more complicated overnight. I started to worry we'd taken a wrong turn, even though I was sure we were retracing our steps. The entire forest seemed different. No friendly chirping or scuttling creatures, just an oppressive silence that made every slight rustle stand out like thunder. At one point, Nadia had to stop to adjust her bootlace. Her ankle was hurting. I told her to do it quickly. As she crouched, I stood guard, scanning the undergrowth. That's when I heard it. A low whistle. Not a bird call. Too human. My skin prickled from head to toe. It came from maybe 20 meters away, though I couldn't pinpoint the exact direction. I hissed at Nadia to hurry. She tied her boot faster than I'd ever seen. We broke into a jog, ignoring the exhaustion in our legs. Then we reached the oak with the face-like carving, the one we'd passed on our first day. We should have been close to the exit by then, maybe another 15 minutes to the car. Relief began to flicker in my chest, but that's when I noticed something new carved beneath the face. A spiral shape, fresh enough that wood chips still clung to the bark. Nadia saw it too. Our eyes met in utter fear. We hadn't passed that spiral before. Someone had carved it since we arrived. We barely spoke for the rest of the trek. We just pushed forward, half limping, half running. At last, the trees began to thin. I glimpsed the lay-by through the foliage. I can't describe the wave of relief that washed over me, seeing my small car parked there, the afternoon sun glinting off its bonnet. We burst from the tree line, panting, adrenaline screaming through our veins. I got to the driver's side and yanked the door open, tossing my rucksack into the back seat. Nadia did the same on her side. Before I started the car, I looked back at the forest. There, partly hidden behind dense brush, was a figure. It was hard to make out details, but I swear they wore something dark. They weren't moving, just watching. My heart hammered in my chest. I wrestled the keys out of my pocket with trembling hands. The engine roared to life. Nadia was practically begging me to drive. I reversed so fast I almost hit a rock behind us, then spun the wheel and tore off down the narrow road. I caught a glimpse of that figure stepping out onto the verge before the forest curved out of sight. They just stood there, as though they wanted us to see them. We didn't breathe easy until we got onto the main A road. Nadia started crying. She's not the type to cry easily, but the relief and terror all hit her at once. I felt numb, eyes locked on the road, scanning the rearview mirror to make sure no one was following. Eventually, we pulled into a petrol station near a town and just sat there for a bit, trying to compose ourselves. When we tried to explain to a cashier what had happened, we probably sounded half mad. No phone signal, footprints around our tents, hearing whispers at night, the rummaging through our belongings. The cashier gave us a sympathetic look, suggested we call the police if we felt threatened. But we had no real evidence beyond footprints and weird carvings. Nobody got physically harmed, and I guess we were too shaken to push for an investigation. We drove back to Nadia's place, not saying much. She crashed on her sofa. I took the spare bedroom. Neither of us slept well that night or the next. In the following days, we talked about going to the authorities, but what could we say? Someone was in the forest at the same time as us. It's not illegal to walk around in the woods. We had no name, no physical description beyond a vague outline in the trees. I did mention the bone arrangements and fresh carvings to a friend, who just shrugged and said some people do weird nature rituals. That didn't comfort me one bit. What really gets me, though, is the sense that whoever was out there wanted us to know they were watching. Those footprints, the rummaging, the fresh carvings, they weren't accidents. It felt like a deliberate game of cat and mouse, designed to unsettle us. And it worked. Even now, weeks later, I find myself waking up in the middle of the night, convinced I can hear leaves crunching outside my window. Nadia's been having panic attacks at work. She told me she can't stop seeing the silhouette in the trees every time she closes her eyes. I've spoken with my counselor about it. She thinks we encountered someone who thrives on scaring campers, maybe some unhinged local or drifter. She encourages me to keep journaling, to process the fear rather than bury it. That's why I'm typing this out, hoping that by articulating the details, I can reclaim some control over the memory. But there's a question that keeps me up at night. What would have happened if we hadn't decided to leave when we did? Would the intruder have escalated? I still can't fully explain the carved symbols. They felt tied to something bigger, like we stumbled upon a pattern or a marker. My friend who'd camped there before never mentioned any of this. But it's possible these things developed after he visited. Or maybe he just never went deep enough to notice. I tried to ask around online to see if anyone else had encountered strange carvings or had items rummaged through at that spot, but I found very little. A couple of vague forum posts about hearing eerie whistling in the Peak District, but nothing conclusive. The weirdest part is that I don't have a neat ending to the story. We left the forest, and that was that. No big showdown, no confrontation. Just an overwhelming sense that if we'd stayed, something worse might have happened. It's left me with a kind of open wound in my mind, an unfinished terror that resurfaces whenever I think about going hiking again. I know Nadia's sworn off camping entirely. She refuses to step foot in any forest for the foreseeable future. As for me, I'm torn. Part of me wants to go back, find answers, or prove to myself I'm not too scared to enjoy the outdoors. Another part of me is terrified that returning would mean walking straight into another trap, maybe something I wouldn't escape next time. So this is me, putting it out there. If anyone reading this has had similar experiences, strange symbols, rearranged stones and bones, a sense of being watched in the woods, let me know I'm not alone. I suppose this is an appeal for answers as much as it is a cautionary tale. Always trust your gut. If you feel someone's watching you out in the wild, don't brush it off. It's easy to write things off as overactive imagination, especially in broad daylight. Especially when the sun's shining and the forest looks picture perfect. But reality can turn on you in a heartbeat. I still don't know who was out there, or what they wanted. We escaped physically unscathed, but it messed with our heads. Every crunch of a twig, every snap of a branch sends me right back to that oppressive silence, the intangible presence among the trees. My plan now is to take a break from outdoor adventures, focus on my mental health, maybe stick to well-populated campsites if I ever decide to try again. But that sense of wonder I used to feel in the woods, it's tainted by fear, and I hate that. Nadia's begun her own search for answers, though more on the spiritual side. She thinks it could have been some cult or group performing ceremonies. I'm more skeptical, leaning towards it just being one very disturbed person. But who knows? If we learned anything, it's that sometimes the wild places we think are safe havens can harbor threats we don't see coming. The forest doesn't offer any disclaimers. It just is, silent and sprawling, a perfect stage for the unknown. People always assume that horror strikes in the dead of night, but I learned it can appear under the blazing sun as well. Daylight doesn't guarantee safety. This was broad day, birds still awake, though oddly quiet, heat shimmering off mossy logs. And yet the fear was as real and visceral as any midnight scare. I can't emphasize enough how the sense of being watched gnawed at us, like the forest itself was in on some twisted game. If you plan on going off-grid, at least tell someone exactly where you'll be and arrange a check-in time. We'd told our families we'd be in the Peak District, but not precisely where. If things had gone really wrong, no one would have known where to find us quickly. And pack something for self-defense, even if it's a loud whistle or a small personal alarm. I hate that I sound paranoid, but I've come to see that being prepared is better than regretting it later. That's all I've got. It's not the most dramatic story, and maybe some people will say I'm overreacting to a few strange noises and footprints. But trust me, living it was beyond terrifying. The adrenaline, the uncertainty, wondering if you're just being paranoid or if there's genuinely a dangerous person lurking behind the next tree. And that final glance, seeing the figure at the forest's edge, motionless, that's seared into my memory, an image I can't unsee. I've replayed it so many times, trying to recall details. Were they tall, male, female? I just remember the dark outline and the sense that they were satisfied watching us leave. Even now, as I type, my pulse speeds up and I find myself checking my windows. That's how deep it goes. Anyway, thanks for listening. Maybe writing it all down will help me reclaim some peace. Part of me still hopes we just stumbled upon some odd recluse, no real threat intended. But deep down, I suspect otherwise. If we'd stayed another night, we might have found out exactly what they wanted, or perhaps we wouldn't have lived to tell the tale. And that uncertainty is the worst horror of all. I never thought a hospital could feel so claustrophobic, but that's exactly how it felt during the strike last month. I'm still trying to piece together the events of those nights. I say nights because it wasn't just one shift, it spanned several. The flashbacks come in patches, like someone scrambled my memories, so bear with me if I jump around a bit. Writing it all down might be the only way I can move forward. I'm a junior doctor, fresh out of foundation training, still a bit wide-eyed about the realities of the NHS. When news broke that many non-essential staff were walking out, I was conflicted. On one hand, I understood their grievances. On the other, I was anxious about how we'd cope with skeleton staffing. I ended up staying on, partly because I felt a sense of duty, partly because I'm saddled with student loans and couldn't risk losing my wages if I joined the strike. As a result, my shifts became nightmarishly long. I was supposed to be on the night rota for the Andy ward for a couple of days, but it got extended to nearly a week because we were so short on staff. Looking back, the first 2 nights went about how I expected, chaotic but manageable. Fewer consultants around, a couple of doctors covering multiple wards. I was part of a small team. Dr. Davis, a seasoned registrar with a no-nonsense attitude. Harriet, a newly qualified nurse who was holding it together but clearly stressed. And me, stumbling my way through triage after triage. We leaned on each other because there was no one else to back us up. The wards felt eerie with half the lights off to conserve power, and entire corridors were empty where normally you'd see bustling staff. It was around the 3rd night that things started to feel off. I remember Harriet and I had just come out of a side room where we'd been assessing a patient with mild head trauma. We stepped into the corridor, and it was deathly silent. That might not sound so odd for late at night, but hospitals usually have this underlying hum, machines beeping, staff chatting, trolleys squeaking. Instead, there was nothing, like the entire building was holding its breath. I brushed it off. We were exhausted after all. I think it was that same night, my memory's hazy, when I first saw someone lurking at the far end of the corridor. It was just a flash, a shadowy figure slipping around a corner. I assumed it was one of the staff on a break, maybe trying to avoid extra tasks. But I mentioned it to Harriet, and she said she'd seen someone in the ward's storeroom earlier, rummaging through supplies. When she'd tried to talk to them, they hurried away without a word. It gave me a prickle of unease, but we had so many patients queued that I couldn't spare more than a fleeting worry. The following day, or was it night, I barely had time to go home, shower and return. The 3 of us were alerted to a missing patient situation. A woman in her 30s, admitted for observation after a minor operation, had apparently vanished from her bed. I vividly recall Dr. Davis's exasperation. We're understaffed enough as it is without people wandering off. We split up, each combing different corridors of the hospital. Even with limited staff, there were still a handful of wards operating, so we asked around. No one had seen her. Security was a joke. Half of them were off due to the strike, and the remaining ones seemed more concerned with bag checks at the entrance than actually patrolling the wards. It took a good hour before someone found the patient in a disused wing of the building, near the maternity ward that had been temporarily shut down. She was disoriented, mumbling about looking for the toilets, but ending up getting lost. It seemed plausible enough, except for the fact that the toilets were clearly signposted. Plus, her surgical dressing had been tampered with. Dr. Davis insisted on checking for self-harm or infection, but her wound was fine, just partially unwrapped. She claimed she didn't remember doing it. I tried asking if someone else had undone her bandages, and she just got this distant expression on her face. We chalked it up to confusion, told her to stay put in her bed. That same night, Harriet left to check on a post-op patient but never returned. After about 30 minutes, Dr. Davis and I went looking for her. We found her in a stairwell, sitting on the steps, white as a sheet. She said someone had followed her down the corridor, but when she turned around, there was no one there. Yet she was certain she heard footsteps matching her pace. We teased her gently about it. Just tired nerves, right? But she was shaking, and Harriet's no wimp. She used to volunteer at care homes dealing with difficult residents. The fact that she was rattled put me on edge. By the time my fourth consecutive night rolled around, I was running on fumes. I'd gone home for maybe 4 hours of broken sleep. My tiny bedsit is near the hospital, just a quick walk away, which was a blessing at first, but felt more like a curse then, because I could never fully escape work. On my way in that evening, I passed the picket line. A few strikers were still out there, holding signs, chanting. They looked exhausted, and I couldn't help but feel a twinge of sympathy. But I had to keep my head down and get inside for my shift. Right away, I noticed the atmosphere was tenser. Dr. Davis pulled me aside to say that a second patient had disappeared earlier in the day. A man recovering from a bad fall. He'd been found wandering in the same disused wing, the old maternity ward. Same story of confusion. No memory of leaving his bed. The hospital's makeshift security confirmed they saw someone on the CCTV leading him away, but the footage was too grainy to identify them. That set alarm bells ringing. Who would lead a patient away from their ward, and why? We tried to reassure the rest of the staff, what little of us there were. Harriet stuck close to me for most of the night. Dr. Davis went back and forth between wards, as we needed a senior figure to sign off on procedures. Around midnight, I was in the triage area alone, catching up on paperwork. The overhead lights buzzed softly, one of them flickering. The waiting area was eerily empty, just a couple of chairs and a coffee machine that was out of order. For a moment, I thought I heard someone whisper my name, but when I looked up, no one was there. I forced myself to focus on the files, but my mind kept drifting, imagining that shadowy figure I'd glimpsed earlier. As the hours stretched on, I felt this growing unease, like the hospital walls were pressing in. At around 2 a.m, Harriet burst in, breathless, telling me she'd spotted someone in the ward storeroom again. She said the person was bent over a trolley of supplies, and when she asked what they were doing, they turned their head just enough for her to see a grin, or at least the shape of it, in the dim light. Then they bolted. Harriet chased them down the corridor, only to lose them at a locked door leading to the old maternity wing. It was the 3rd or 4th time we'd heard about that wing in as many days, so we decided enough was enough. Harriet and I marched down there, determined to get some answers. We had to pass through a connecting corridor that was half lit, the overhead fluorescents flickering. I remember the hush. No hum of machines, no bustle of staff, just our footsteps echoing. When we reached the door, it was indeed locked, but it looked like someone had tampered with it. Scratches on the metal, bits of paint chipped away. I'll be honest, I was half ready to turn back, but Harriet's expression was pure determination. We found a side entrance that was supposed to be sealed off, but the chain looked loose, probably from years of neglect. We squeezed through. Immediately, the air felt colder, stale. The corridor on the other side was lined with empty rooms, doors slightly ajar. Old signage still hung on the walls. Delivery suite, neonatal, staff only, all covered in dust. As we ventured further, torchlight cutting through the gloom, we caught glimpses of old equipment shoved against walls, incubators, rusted stands, an abandoned wheelchair. The place hadn't been used in years, but there were footprints in the dust. Fresh footprints. We followed them, They led us to a set of double doors with a sign, "Authorized personnel only." One of the doors was slightly open. We stepped inside, hearts pounding. It was a large room, presumably once a ward or some kind of storage space. Our torch beams roamed over stacked boxes and old hospital beds. Then Harriet gripped my arm, and I followed her gaze. In the corner, there was a bed that looked recently used. The sheets weren't as dusty, and there were empty wrappers on a small table beside it. But more disturbing was a metal stand with various medical tools. Some looked new or at least well-maintained. Gauze, bandages, scalpels. Harriet picked up a scalpel. It was sharp, glinting in the torchlight. My stomach lurched. Someone was playing doctor in here, or worse. Before we could process it, we heard a click behind us. We spun around to see a figure standing in the doorway, blocking our exit. The light from the corridor illuminated just enough to reveal the silhouette, but not the face. They were tall, wearing something that might have been a long coat or dark scrubs. In a low voice, they said, "You shouldn't be here." My blood turned to ice. Harriet shone her torch at them, demanding to know who they were. They didn't answer. Instead, they took a step forward, and I saw a glint of metal in their hand. A scalpel, another tool. My adrenaline spiked, and I shouted for them to stay back. They lunged. Harriet let out a scream as she dropped her torch. I fumbled for mine, nearly dropping it as well. The figure grabbed a metal tray from a nearby bed and swung it towards Harriet's head. She ducked, but it still clipped her shoulder. I rushed forward, trying to push them away, but they were stronger than they looked. We all stumbled, the tray clattering to the floor. For a moment, I thought Harriet was badly hurt, but she scrambled up, breathing heavily. In the flickering light, I caught a glimpse of the attacker's face, wide-eyed, intense, like they were in some manic state. They jabbed with whatever sharp object they held. I leapt back, nearly tripping over an old stool. My mind was racing with survival instincts, all that first aid training ironically flipping on its head as I tried not to become a patient. Harriet grabbed a metal pole from one of the ancient IV stands and swung it, catching the attacker's arm. They hissed, staggering to the side. That gave us a split second to bolt for the door. Harriet dragged me forward, and we ran into the corridor, our footsteps echoing. Behind us, I heard the figure's ragged breathing and frantic footsteps. They were chasing us. We tore down the corridor, past the dusty rooms, hearts hammering so loud it was deafening. The locked door leading back to the main hospital was ahead. We had no time to fish for keys, so we threw our weight against it. To our shock, it banged open. Someone must have forced it earlier. We stumbled into the lit corridor, nearly colliding with Dr. Davis, who was right there, alarmed by our shouting. Harriet shrieked at him to help. He turned, seeing our panic, and he immediately stepped between us and the door. That's when the attacker burst through. Dr. Davis isn't the sort to back down. He shoved the figure hard. They careened into the wall, dropping their tool, which clanged on the floor. Harriet and I scrambled to grab something to defend ourselves, but Dr. Davis was already wrestling the figure to the ground. He pinned their arms, bellowing for security. Within minutes, though it felt like an eternity, 2 of the hospital's remaining security staff appeared, along with a porter who'd heard the commotion. They managed to restrain the attacker. That's when we finally saw them clearly. A disheveled man who looked to be in his late 20s, wearing tatty scrubs that definitely weren't hospital issue. He was ranting incoherently about research and experiments. It turned my stomach. Harriet clung to me, trembling. Dr. Davis kept a firm hand on the man's shoulder until security cuffed him. The man then let out a scream that echoed down the corridor, a sound that still haunts me. It turns out he'd been sneaking around for days, using the disused maternity wing as a base of sorts. The police later speculated he might have been tampering with patients' medication or simply luring them away for his twisted fantasies. We found half-empty vials of sedatives, fresh syringes, stolen from the supply rooms. It explained why those patients were so confused when they wandered off. They'd been drugged. My memories from that point blur. I recall giving statements to the police in the staff room, Harriet crying softly as Dr. Davis tried to comfort her, his arms bruised from the scuffle. The man was taken away in handcuffs. An ambulance was called to check Harriet's shoulder, which was badly bruised but thankfully not broken. I remember pacing the corridor in a daze, trying to make sense of it all. The hospital admin showed up, along with the night manager. Everyone looked shell-shocked, as though we'd all woken from a nightmare we hadn't realized we were living. Harriet and I ended our shift early that night. I mean, we were basically done anyway. They sent us home in a taxi. The next few days I had to continue working, though. The strike was still on, we were still understaffed, and trauma doesn't wait. In any other situation, I'd have been given time off, but we didn't have enough staff to cover the wards. I felt torn between wanting to run away from that place and feeling an obligation to help the genuine patients who needed me. Eventually, the strike ended, staff numbers returned to normal, and the hospital administration tried to sweep the incident under the rug. They released a statement that someone unauthorized had been found on hospital premises and that security measures were being reviewed, but we all knew how close we'd come to something horrific. If Harriet hadn't walked in on him rummaging through supplies, if we hadn't decided to investigate, who knows what he would have done. A few days after the confrontation, the police informed me that the attacker had some kind of personal vendetta against hospitals due to a family tragedy years ago. Something about malpractice allegations that never stuck. I didn't get all the details. It's probably part of an ongoing investigation. But it sent a chill through me. He had a motive, albeit twisted, to hurt people in the place that was meant to heal them. Harriet quit a week later. She said she couldn't handle the anxiety of walking through those corridors anymore. She's gone back to a smaller clinic outside the city, somewhere calmer. Dr. Davis, on the other hand, has stayed on, but I can tell he's not the same. He's quieter, and I catch him glancing over his shoulder sometimes. As for me, I've stuck around, though I'm not sure why. Maybe a stubborn sense of duty, maybe because I can't afford to leave. But the nights are the worst. I can't walk alone down a corridor without my pulse quickening, half expecting to see that lurking figure again. I've started therapy, which feels a bit surreal considering how many times I've told patients they might benefit from talking to someone. Now I'm the one in the chair, hands clasped, describing flashbacks and nightmares. I dream about that old maternity ward, the scalpel glinting in torchlight, the feeling of being chased. Sometimes I see the missing patients wandering the halls, calling my name. It takes every ounce of self-control to show up for my shift afterwards and not break down at every door that squeaks open unexpectedly. I'm sharing this because hospitals are supposed to be sanctuaries for the sick and injured. We're not trained to deal with sinister figures lurking in abandoned wings, tampering with medications. We're taught about patient confidentiality, triage protocols, and emergency procedures, but not about how to handle someone who sees a hospital as their personal hunting ground. That's something I hope no one else has to face. But if you do, trust your instincts. If something feels off, speak up, investigate, get help. Don't shrug off a looming shape in a corridor or mysterious footprints in a locked area. I keep thinking about the patients who ended up in that old wing. Were they lucky to have escaped? Did they brush it off as a strange dream? Some didn't even recall how they got there. If Harriet and I hadn't intervened, how many more might he have tricked or forced into that dusty corner room? The scariest part is that I used to think I was immune to fear in a hospital. I've seen severe injuries, coded patients, handled life or death situations. But that night showed me a different breed of terror. The kind that seeps in when you realize someone is using your workplace, your place of healing, to enact something dark and personal. It's not an illness you can diagnose or treat. It's human malice, and that's harder to predict than any disease. I still work nights sometimes because that's the rota I'm given. Dr. Davis and I keep a closer watch now. Security has supposedly been ramped up, though you wouldn't know it. New cameras, some half-hearted ID checks. But I suppose it's better than nothing. Every once in a while I catch a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, a flicker of movement, a shape in dark scrubs, and I freeze for a heartbeat. Then I realize it's just a colleague, or my own reflection in a glass panel. My heart doesn't stop hammering quite so fast, though. I'm hoping the nightmares will fade. Maybe they will, with time. For now, I'm trying to do my job with some semblance of normality. Patients still need me, and I try to remind myself that, for the most part, people come to hospital to get better. That's what keeps me going. That's what makes me slip on my ID badge each night and push through those corridors, no matter how uneasy they make me feel. Maybe that's the only way to reclaim the space from what happened, by refusing to let terror take root. Easier said than done, but I'm doing my best. If you've made it this far, thanks for reading. It means a lot just to get it all out. The hospital's official line is that the issue's been resolved, but we, the staff who were there, know it's not that simple. Fear doesn't vanish with an arrest. It lingers, in the broken chain on a sealed door, in the flickering lights of an empty corridor, in the memory of an unhinged person lying in wait. I'm determined not to let it define me, though some nights it does. I suppose that's all part of the healing process, ironically enough. That's my story. If you ever find yourself alone in a massive building at night, especially one meant for care, remember, sometimes the real threats aren't the frantic patients or the medical emergencies. Sometimes it's the people who slip unnoticed through the cracks, harboring their own dark motives. Stay alert, trust your gut, and hold on to the reason you're there in the first place. It might be the only thing that keeps you grounded when your world turns upside down. I've been debating whether to share this next story because it still makes me feel vulnerable and, to be honest, a bit ridiculous. But then I think back on the chaos of that weekend, and I remember how close I came to real danger, maybe even death. So here goes. If nothing else, maybe someone can learn from my mistakes. I live in a small village down in the southwest, not far from the coast. It's quaint with narrow lanes and old stone cottages, the sort of place people move to when they want a quieter life. But once a year, our population quadruples for what we call the Lake and Bridge Summer Festival. It's a big deal for us. Food stalls, local crafts, a small fun fair, live music in the village square. Everyone turns out, including families from neighboring towns. It's possibly the most crowded this village ever gets. I usually volunteer at the festival, help set up stalls, man the raffle, that sort of thing. This year, I decided to just enjoy it as a punter. Work had been draining, and I needed a break. My plan was to wander around the stalls, catch up with neighbors, maybe watch the big parade on the second day. I should mention I was also trying to get past a recent breakup, so part of me just wanted to lose myself in the crowd, not dwell on personal drama. The festival kicked off on a Friday morning and was set to run until Sunday evening. I showed up bright and early, grabbed a homemade scone from Mrs. Townsend's bakery stall, and strolled through the village center, soaking in the atmosphere. It was a scorching day, one of those uncharacteristically hot British summers. So everyone was out in shorts and sun hats, kids running around with ice creams melting down their arms. Around midday, I noticed a group of strangers. Nothing unusual in a festival crowd, but something about them stuck out. They wore matching dark t-shirts, seemed to move in a tight cluster. At first, I thought they might be a band or a performance troupe, but none of them looked like they were carrying instruments or costumes. They were just observing. I caught one of them looking at me intently, a tall woman with close-cropped hair. I gave her a polite nod and carried on. The day wore on, and I forgot about it in the midst of all the dancing, music, and general excitement. That evening, I was in the beer garden of our local pub with a group of friends, enjoying a pint. The place was heaving, everyone in high spirits. Then I spotted the same group of strangers near the bar. The tall woman was there, along with two men and another woman. They scanned the crowd, not quite joining in the festivities, but not exactly shy either. One of my mates, Sam, joked that they looked like tourists who'd got lost on their way to Stonehenge. We laughed it off, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching people, including me, a bit too closely. Saturday came, the hottest day yet, and the festival was in full swing by mid-morning. The big parade was scheduled for the afternoon, and I decided to walk around the craft stalls first. As I was inspecting some handmade pottery, I felt a tap on my shoulder. It was that tall woman. She asked if I knew where the parade route started. I pointed her towards the village square. She thanked me, but didn't move away. Instead, she asked if I was enjoying the festival, how long I'd lived in the village, and whether I had family here. Something in her tone was off, like she was gathering data more than making friendly chit-chat. I tried to be polite but non-committal, keeping my answers short. Eventually, she drifted away, or so I thought. Moments later, I saw her rejoin the cluster of people in the matching t-shirts. It was then I noticed the words on their shirts: Event Sure Security. My first assumption was that they were some private security firm hired for the festival. Maybe we'd expanded beyond our local volunteer stewards. But no one had mentioned it to me, and I usually hear about festival logistics. The parade was brilliant. Colorful floats, local school children in costumes, a marching band. I got swept up in the excitement, pressing in with the crowd along the narrow high street. At one point, I ended up near Sam and a few others, cheering on the dancers. That's when I felt a presence behind me, and I turned to see two of the Event Sure people standing uncomfortably close. One had a small device in their hand, possibly a radio, but I saw them tapping something on a phone screen, glancing in my direction. A chill crept up my spine. Why me? Or was I being paranoid? As soon as the parade ended, I tried to slip away. I wove through the throngs of visitors, heading for a quieter side street. My plan was to pop into my cottage, maybe freshen up, then come back out later. The festival was still going strong, but the crush of people was intense, and I needed a break. I'd almost reached the lane leading to my place when someone grabbed my arm. I spun around, startled. It was the tall woman again. She was breathless, apologizing for startling me. She said she just needed a quick word. I asked if she was festival security. She hesitated, then nodded. Said they were a new firm brought in for undercover crowd management. That struck me as odd. Why would they be wearing matching t-shirts if they were undercover? Plus, our village council never mentioned any external company. I demanded to see some ID, and she fumbled in her pocket, pulling out a laminated card with Event Sure printed on it. It looked generic, something you could order online. She then told me there'd been reports of suspicious activity in the festival area and asked if I'd noticed anything. I said no, and that I was heading home. She seemed reluctant to let me leave, insisting I check in with her colleague at the main square first, but I refused. Something about this felt like a con, or worse. She let go of my arm, but not without giving me a hard stare, like she was memorizing my face. Back at my cottage, I locked the door, my heart pounding. I tried to ring one of the festival organizers, a friend on the parish council, but my call went to voicemail. I paced around, considering my options. Was I overreacting, or was there genuinely something off about this security group? Eventually, I decided to calm down and head back out, maybe find the actual volunteer stewards and see if they knew anything about Event Sure. Late afternoon sun beat down on the square when I returned. People were milling about, enjoying the post-parade lull before the evening's live music. I spotted one of our official stewards, Eric, wearing the bright yellow tabard we hand out each year. I asked if the council had hired an external security firm. He frowned, saying he'd never heard of Event Sure, and that the only outside help we had were a couple of paramedics on standby. Immediately, my worry intensified. I explained the situation, and Eric looked alarmed. He said he'd keep an eye out, and we agreed to meet near the church steps if we saw anything else suspicious. As I walked away, I realized the Event Sure group could be anywhere in the crowd, observing me. I suddenly felt exposed. More than that, I felt responsible for warning people. That evening, the festival committee held a small opening ceremony for the night's performances, with a local band set to play. A big crowd gathered in the square, families perched on picnic blankets, older couples on folding chairs. I tried to find Eric among the sea of faces, but it was too packed. I started to feel claustrophobic, scanning for any sign of the Event Sure shirts. That's when I spotted them at the edge of the crowd. 4 individuals, including the tall woman, each standing in a different spot, as if surrounding the square. I made my way towards one of them, a stocky man, determined to confront him. But as I drew nearer, he slipped behind a cluster of people. I followed, my heart racing. I lost sight of him near a drink stall. Then I felt a hand on my back. Startled, I turned. This time it was Sam, asking if I was all right. I explained in a rushed whisper what was going on. Sam, ever the skeptic, shrugged it off at first. But when I insisted, pointing out the suspicious group, he agreed we should speak to them together. We found 2 of them by the corner of the square, chatting quietly. Sam and I approached, and I demanded to know what was going on. why they were claiming to be security when our organizers knew nothing about them. One of them, a wiry man with close-cropped hair, gave a polite smile and said it was a misunderstanding, that they were just festival enthusiasts wearing matching t-shirts. I pressed further, mentioning the tall woman. He denied everything, acting confused. Sam pointed at his shirt. The man just shrugged, saying it was a random design. My blood boiled. I knew they were lying. Sam and I walked away at a loss, heading towards the church steps to find Eric. But Eric wasn't there. I asked a couple of people if they'd seen him, and one woman said she saw him being led away by some official-looking chap in a black t-shirt. My stomach twisted. Sam and I tore through the crowd, searching. No sign of Eric. That's when the tall woman appeared again, stepping out from behind the church wall as if she'd been waiting for us. She flashed that same laminate ID and said Eric was handling a security issue by the pub, that we should go wait for him there. Something about her tone made my skin crawl. Sam demanded she stop messing around. Without warning, she leaned in and hissed, "Stop asking questions, it's safer that way." Then she melted back into the crowd before we could react. Sam stared at me, jaw clenched. "We've got to call the police," he said. We found a quiet spot by a market stall, rummaged for our phones. Neither of us had signal. It wasn't unusual to lose signal in a throng of festival goers, but my phone usually picked up at least one bar somewhere. Sam tried his phone too. Same result. A man at the stall next to us mentioned that reception had been spotty all afternoon, probably overloaded by visitors. We decided to run to my cottage and call from there. We pushed our way through the crowd, but just as we reached the road leading to my place, two of the Event Sure group stepped into our path. One was the wiry man, the other someone I hadn't seen before, an imposing figure with a shaved head. They blocked the lane, arms folded. Sam demanded they move aside. The wiry man smirked. "Don't worry about your friend Eric," he said, ignoring our question. "He's safe, for now." A cold dread filled me. This was more than some random intimidation. These people were orchestrating something, using the festival as cover. Adrenaline surging, Sam and I darted to the left, aiming to circle around through a narrow alley behind the bakery. They followed. We could hear their footsteps on the cobblestones, quickening whenever we tried to speed up. A group of oblivious tourists blocked the alley exit, snapping photos of the old buildings. We had to weave around them, heart pounding, trying not to cause a scene. The Event Sure men were right behind us. Finally, we broke free into the next street, sprinting towards my cottage at the far end. One door away, Sam yelped in pain. I spun around to see him on the ground, the wiry man gripping his shirt collar. I rushed back, shouting for help. The imposing figure reached for me, but I managed to dodge. My cry for help must have attracted a few passers-by, because suddenly a small crowd gathered, startled by the confrontation. Here's the surreal part. The Event Sure men immediately switched tactics. They let Sam go, then started telling the crowd we were causing trouble, that we were disruptive festival goers. Sam tried to shout that they were lying, but the men sounded so authoritative, so sure of themselves, that some of the onlookers hesitated. I saw confusion on their faces. The wiry man pulled out his phony ID, claiming to be official security. A couple of locals who recognized me stepped in, saying they'd never heard of Event Sure. The tension was palpable. Someone in the crowd must have run to fetch the real festival organizers, because the next thing I knew, a couple of them arrived, faces full of concern. That's when the Event Sure men tried to slip away, but the onlookers weren't having it, blocking their path. A local policeman who'd been off duty, but attending the festival, joined us. In a matter of moments, the men were surrounded, while the tall woman and the others were nowhere to be seen. The policeman demanded to see official documents. The wiry man tried to bluff, but under pressure, his story fell apart. The policeman called for backup using his personal radio. He'd brought it just in case. Soon, a proper response unit arrived from the next town over. They took the wiry man and his colleague into custody. Sam, breathless and bruised, told them about Eric being lured away. The police quickly organized a search. It turned out Eric had been taken to a disused farm building on the outskirts of the village. He was found tied up but unharmed, apparently guarded by two other Event Sure people, who fled as soon as they heard sirens. Eric was in shock, but physically okay. None of us could fathom what their ultimate goal was. Kidnapping for ransom? Some bizarre scam? The police suspect they were planning to extort money from local festival organizers under the guise of protecting them. Maybe they intended to snatch a high-profile local figure or cause enough panic to enforce their fake security services. It was never fully clarified. The group's leader, presumably the tall woman, vanished without a trace. The two men who were arrested refused to speak beyond claiming, "We were just following orders." The rest of the festival was canceled by the parish council. Understandable given the circumstances. Residents were left shaken, outraged, and a bit humiliated that our friendly village event had been targeted in such a brazen way. Sam needed a few stitches in his knee from the scuffle. Eric recovered, but he hasn't been the same since. He doesn't volunteer for public events anymore, which is a real loss for our community. As for me, I feel guilty that I couldn't do more to stop them sooner. Maybe if I'd alerted the organizers right away, Eric wouldn't have been taken. Then again, everything happened so fast, and these people were clearly professionals. I did eventually speak to the local constabulary for a statement, and they told me not to blame myself. It's likely the group had done similar stunts elsewhere, targeting events in smaller towns or villages. The scariest takeaway is how easily people believed their ruse. By wearing matching t-shirts and acting like they were in charge, they almost successfully infiltrated our festival. They used technology too, jamming signals or something along those lines, because many festival goers complained of lost reception. It was all calculated to isolate us from outside help. It's been a month now, and I still get paranoid every time I see a group wearing matching shirts or whenever I hear about a big event in another village. I keep imagining that tall woman slipping through the crowd, picking a new target. The police are still investigating. They've asked me to identify the men in custody from a lineup, which I did, but it hasn't led to major leads on the rest of the group. I suppose time will tell if they're caught. Until then, I worry they're out there, planning something else. I'm sharing this because it's easy to let your guard down in a festive setting, surrounded by friends and neighbors. But apparently, that's exactly when some criminals strike. They rely on the trusting, carefree atmosphere. If you see something that feels off, speak up. Ask questions. Don't assume that anyone in a uniform or with an official-sounding name is legitimate. And if you're organizing an event, don't skimp on verifying who you hire or who you let in. We learned that the hard way. At least we had some form of intervention from the local police officer who happened to be around. If not for him, and for the crowd that refused to let the men just walk away, Sam and I might have been overpowered, and Eric could have remained missing for who knows how long. The thought still keeps me awake some nights, along with the vision of the tall woman's unsettling stare. I'm sure the Lake and Bridge Summer Festival will return next year, but the innocence of it won't. This whole ordeal left a stain on our close-knit community. We've installed more CCTV around the square and a better communication setup to ensure phone signals don't get jammed. It's a shame we have to be so cautious, but that's the world we live in, I suppose. At least no one was permanently harmed. It could have been so much worse. So that's it, really. My advice? Don't let a crowd lull you into complacency. Keep an eye on who's watching you, especially if they claim to be looking out for your safety. Sometimes the real danger can hide behind an official-looking badge or even a matching t-shirt. Stay alert, trust your gut, and if you see a friend being led away by someone suspicious, don't hesitate to sound the alarm. You might just save them from a fate no one should have to face. Anyway, I'm back at my cottage now, trying to return to normal life. The village is quiet again, the festival bunting taken down. People still gossip about the fake security whenever they gather at the pub. But life moves on, as it always does. I only hope that sharing my story will help someone else see the signs before it's too late. We all deserve to enjoy a community event without fear, but as I've learned, a crowd can be a perfect cover for those with sinister intentions. Don't let them catch you unawares. I'm finally writing this all down because my head's spinning with guilt and second-guessing, and I honestly think sharing it might help me sleep again. People always talk about how family feuds can boil over into disaster, but I never imagined mine would lead me into a situation straight out of a nightmare. I was naive, I suppose, thinking that time would heal old wounds without me having to do anything. That's not how it works, apparently. A bit of context. I come from a big, complicated family. My granddad, rest his soul, was a respected professor of archaeology. His achievements put our family name on the map, especially in academic circles. When he passed away, he left behind a messy estate and an even messier legacy, including feuds between my mom and her younger brother, my Uncle Raymond. Uncle Raymond has always been something of a black sheep, an underachiever who felt overshadowed by Granddad's success and resentful about the inheritance. I grew up hearing about old arguments, property disputes, accusations. I tried to keep out of it as much as possible, but I was inevitably dragged in from time to time. Mom once told me, "Raymond's got this chip on his shoulder. Watch yourself." I'm 27 now, living in central Manchester, working part-time at a marketing firm while finishing a degree in art history. My focus? Museum studies and curation, ironically enough, which got me an invitation to assist with an exhibit in Oxford last summer. The exhibit was a tribute to my granddad's contributions in British archaeology, organized by a museum that once sponsored his excavations. I was honored and excited to be part of it. The trouble started when I found out Uncle Raymond would be attending the exhibit's opening as well. Part of me thought it was good news, maybe a chance to bury the hatchet, but a small voice inside warned me he'd stir up trouble. He'd never forgiven me for taking after Granddad, as he put it, or for pursuing a path that aligned so closely with the old man's passion. He used to sneer at my interests, calling me a mini version of Granddad. In the lead up to the opening, I emailed him an olive branch of sorts, just a polite note saying I looked forward to seeing him. No reply. Figures. Anyway, the exhibit was scheduled to coincide with a big city marathon weekend. Thousands of people were set to flood the city center, roads would be closed, and the museum expected massive footfall. Great for publicity, but chaos for me. I'm not a fan of big crowds. I also had to commute from Manchester. Between the trains crammed with marathon spectators and the sweltering summer weather, I arrived in Oxford already frazzled. I remember stepping into the museum lobby, air-conditioned bliss, and being met by the curator, Dr. Hartley. She was kind, if a bit brisk, and whisked me off to the staff room for a quick briefing. We'd set up a special corner of the gallery to display some of my granddad's personal research notes, a few of his excavation tools, and letters he exchanged with other academics. Dr. Hartley told me the big unveiling would happen at midday, right when the marathon's leading runners were expected to pass by outside. My role was to ensure everything was in order, greet visitors, and answer questions about Granddad's legacy. Things went smoothly at first. The museum staff were pleasant. The exhibit layout looked fantastic. I watched families wandering through, kids looking impressed by ancient artifacts. Around 11 in the morning, Uncle Raymond appeared at the entrance, sporting a scowl that could sour milk. He barely acknowledged me, heading straight to the exhibit area with purposeful strides. The tension was palpable. I tried to approach him, but all he said was, "Don't meddle in things you don't understand." Then he vanished among the visitors. I shrugged it off, though I did notice I was shaking a bit. Maybe it was adrenaline or leftover nerves from the journey. Midday came, the official unveiling kicked off. Dr. Hartley gave a short speech about my granddad's contributions, praising his meticulous fieldwork and philanthropic efforts in preserving historical sites. I stood at the side, scanning the crowd. My uncle was nowhere to be seen. I tried to focus on the speech, but something tugged at my mind. The museum's security guard, a bloke named Dennis, had mentioned we'd had a slight break-in scare the night before, with someone tampering with the storeroom door. Nothing stolen, but it put everyone on edge. Now my uncle's presence, combined with that, gnawed at me. I felt uneasy, but I couldn't pinpoint why. After the speech, visitors flooded into the newly unveiled section. I answered questions about the displayed letters, explaining how Granddad corresponded with museums worldwide. I almost forgot my uncle's strange remark until I saw him near the glass case holding Granddad's old excavation kit. He was glaring at it as though it had personally offended him. I headed over cautiously. "Is everything all right, Uncle?" He avoided eye contact. "This is a load of rubbish. The museum's glossing over the truth." I had no idea what that meant. Which truth? He just muttered something about half the story and pushed past me, disappearing into the throng again. I let him go. He'd always been dramatic, prone to conspiracy theories. I decided to let him stew. Things carried on fairly normally until around 2 in the afternoon. That's when Dennis pulled me aside. He'd found a suspicious note on the museum's back staircase, apparently referencing my granddad's personal papers, saying something like, "The hidden evidence will come out." It was typed, so no handwriting clues. My stomach lurched. Could Uncle Raymond have left it? He'd always claimed Granddad had secrets, that the estate was hiding something. I told Dennis about my uncle's long-standing grudge, but I wasn't sure if he'd stooped to leaving ominous notes. Dennis asked me to keep an eye out, which I agreed to do, though I was no detective. Around 4, the marathon outside was at full swing, with waves of runners pounding past the museum. Each wave seemed bigger and louder, and the museum staff tried to capitalize by inviting spectators inside for a breather. The lobby turned into a sea of sweaty visitors, rummaging through the gift shop or queuing for the loos. I found it overwhelming, but I plastered on a polite smile. That's when I noticed a man I didn't recognize, standing by one of the staff-only doors. He was tall, wearing a baseball cap, possibly in his late 30s. He seemed out of place. He caught my eye and immediately ducked down the corridor. I followed, curiosity piqued. He slipped through a door marked Storage and Archives. That door was meant to be locked to the public, so either he had a stolen key or someone had left it open. My mind raced. Could this be related to the earlier break-in scare? I lingered outside, torn between going in or calling for Dennis. Finally, I decided to confront him. I poked my head through the door, stepping into a dimly lit hallway lined with shelves of crates and boxes. I spotted the man at the far end, rummaging in what looked like a battered cardboard box. Papers were scattered on a nearby table. "Excuse me," I called, my voice echoing. "Are you allowed to be in here?" He froze, then turned slowly. The overhead light revealed sharp features and a tense expression. His eyes flicked to my museum staff badge, really just a temporary pass with my name on it, and he frowned. "They told me to wait here," he said, sounding unconvincing. "Told you who?" I took a step closer, noticing the box was labeled with my granddad's name. Panic jolted through me. "That's a private collection." He shrugged, glancing at the scattered papers. "I'm just looking for something." I took another step, heart racing. "You can't be in here. Hand me those documents." He backed up, clutching a handful of papers. For a moment I thought he might dash for the exit, but then footsteps pounded behind me, making me jump. It was Uncle Raymond, of all people. "So this is how you do it," he spat, glaring at me, helping the museum hide the real story. I was thoroughly confused. "What are you on about?" I demanded. "And who is this bloke?" Raymond ignored me, turning to the man. "You said you'd show me the proof that my father falsified his records. Now you're messing about in a storeroom." The man looked flustered. "It's not in the official exhibit. Must be hidden back here." My head spun. Was this man working with Uncle Raymond to dredge up some scandal? "What proof?" I asked, stepping closer. "Granddad never falsified anything. What are you talking about?" Raymond advanced, face twisting with anger. He covered up the origins of certain artifacts, took credit for digs he never personally led, left other names off the record. He took away opportunities that should have been mine, our entire family's. I know it's in his private correspondence. I tried to wrap my head around it. I'd never heard a whisper of such allegations. Granddad was widely respected. Sure, he was human. He might have made mistakes. But forging entire records sounded outlandish. If he did something wrong, why do you care now? He's gone. You can't change the past. Raymond's eyes blazed. "I want the truth out. Or do you want to keep shining your halo with his stolen glory?" Suddenly, the man with the baseball cap shoved past me, trying to bolt towards the corridor. I instinctively grabbed his arm. He twisted free, knocking a stack of boxes to the ground. Papers and old photos spilled across the floor. Footsteps thundered as Dennis ran in, alerted by the commotion. He tackled the man with surprising force, pinning him down. Raymond stumbled back, eyes wide. In the chaos, I knelt to gather the scattered documents. One paper caught my eye, A letter from Granddad to some old colleague, referencing an excavation date that didn't match the official museum records. I felt a twinge of unease. Could there be some truth to Uncle Raymond's ravings? I shoved the letter aside, focusing on the immediate crisis. Dennis was radioing for help, struggling to hold the man still. Raymond used that moment of distraction to snatch the letter from my hand and sprint further into the storeroom, weaving between shelves. I shouted for him to stop, but he vanished around a corner. Dennis's priority was holding the other man. I had no choice but to chase my uncle alone. The storeroom was a maze, poorly lit, filled with dusty crates. I followed the sound of Raymond's frantic footsteps, heart hammering. A million thoughts crashed through my mind. What if there really was a hidden scandal? Did that matter now? And where had Raymond found this random partner? I emerged into a small side room crammed with old display cases. Raymond stood at the far wall, fiddling with a locked glass cabinet. He whirled when he heard me. "Stay back," he snapped, brandishing an old metal rod, part of a dismantled stand. "I've got no qualms hitting you if you get in my way." My mouth went dry. "Listen, Uncle, let's be rational. If you have genuine proof of wrongdoing, let's take it to Dr. Hartley. We can—" He cut me off with a laugh that sounded half-crazed. "Do you think the museum wants its star professor tarnished? They'll bury it all. They already tried." I inched forward, hands raised. "That's not how they operate." "Shut up!" he roared, knocking the locked cabinet with the rod. The glass cracked. I winced, picturing the priceless items possibly stored inside. "I know what's in here," he muttered. "The real diaries from that 1972 dig. They'll prove Father never set foot on that site." I'd never heard about a 1972 dig specifically. "Where did you get that from? Is that what the letter said?" He glared, waving the folded letter. "It references a switch. Real diaries locked away, replaced by forgeries in the archive." My mind reeled. It was plausible that diaries could exist. Granddad was meticulous about journaling, but forging them, it sounded so extreme. I took a cautious step closer. "Look, we don't have to do this like a pair of criminals. We can talk. If there's a scandal, it needs to be addressed properly. Right now, you're just smashing glass and threatening me." He stared at me for a long moment, breathing heavily. Then he lowered the rod slightly as though reconsidering. My hopes rose, but just then, a sudden series of bangs came from behind me. The storeroom door burst open, and museum staff poured in, along with the police who'd apparently arrived on site for crowd control outside. The marathon had drawn a few officers to the vicinity. In the commotion, Raymond panicked. He swung the rod again, shattering the cabinet's glass. Shards rained down. I instinctively ducked. One policeman lunged, grabbing him. He struggled, cursing, the rod clattering to the floor. As they wrestled him, he dropped the letter. I scooped it up, heart pounding. My uncle roared accusations at me at Granddad at the museum. The policeman pinned him, reading him his rights. Museum staff huddled in shock, not quite sure what they'd walked into. In the aftermath, everyone tried to figure out who was who. The baseball cap man was taken away by the police, still refusing to give a proper statement. Uncle Raymond, too, was let off. He shouted over his shoulder, "You're complicit in the lies. If you don't reveal the truth, I will." I stood there trembling, glass crunching underfoot, not sure what to say. Dr. Hartley eventually approached, face pale. "Are you hurt?" she asked. I shook my head, though I felt dazed. She looked at the broken cabinet. "We'll have to check if anything's missing or damaged. This is a disaster." When security had cleared the area, I found myself alone in a corner, holding that letter. I skimmed its contents. It was vague, yet hinted at something real, a discrepancy in Granddad's official timeline. I wasn't sure if it proved forgery, or if it was simply an internal correction never publicly acknowledged. Either way, it was enough to suggest some wrongdoing. I felt sick to my stomach. I respected my Granddad's memory dearly. I always assumed his reputation was pristine. Now I had doubts swirling in my mind. The rest of the day was a blur. The museum closed early due to the incident. Marathon runners and spectators outside seemed oblivious to the drama happening within. The police took my statement, asking if I believed Raymond had orchestrated the break-in. I had to be honest. It seemed likely, but I couldn't be certain. They also asked me about the letter, and I handed it over. They said they'd copy it for their file. I felt strangely protective of it, like giving away a piece of Granddad's legacy. But I had no choice. I spent that night in a cheap hotel, tossing and turning. The next morning, I met Dr. Hartley and Dennis again at the museum. The place was subdued, staff on edge, the storeroom corridor blocked off while the police finished collecting evidence. I kept expecting Uncle Raymond to pop up, ranting about conspiracies, but he was still in custody. The museum insisted they'd press charges for vandalism and attempted theft. A part of me felt sorry for him, but another part was furious for the havoc he'd caused. Later, the police let me read the letter once more in a back office. It mentioned an associate of Granddad's who had been asked to keep diaries safe until the official record was corrected. The diaries apparently never resurfaced. Could they be the diaries in that broken cabinet? The museum's archivist said those diaries were actually partial notes, not the full record. So maybe Uncle Raymond's claims were nonsense. Or maybe the real diaries were lost ages ago. The archivist found no sign of them. No clue that we'd ever had them. I left more perplexed than ever. Within a couple of days, I returned to Manchester. The museum fiasco started fading from the headlines, overshadowed by marathon news and typical city drama. But inside me, the questions raged on. What if Granddad really did cut corners or claim undue credit for a dig? Would that truly invalidate his entire career? And what did it mean for me, hoping to follow in his footsteps? Uncle Raymond was released on bail. He tried to contact me via email. I debated ignoring him, but eventually I opened his message. It was a rambling diatribe about exposing the family lie, demanding that I join him in searching for the diaries so we could prove Granddad's wrongdoing. He claimed it would set the record straight, that we owed it to the academic world. I was torn. Part of me wanted answers, but I doubted his intentions. Did he truly seek the truth, or just revenge? A few days later, I found an unmarked envelope in my post. Inside was a photocopy of another letter, this one from the mid-70s, referencing the same dig. It looked legit, though it might have been fabricated. No sender info, no note. I started to feel like I was caught in some bizarre conspiracy. Raymond? Or could it be that baseball cap man, sending me clues? I considered going to the police, but the letter didn't seem threatening, just more talk of hidden journals. I ended up going back to see Dr. Hartley quietly, the following weekend. I asked if the museum had discovered anything in the storeroom. She said no. The diaries in that locked cabinet were all accounted for. They only covered a different excavation site from 1975, nothing about 1972. But she admitted certain sections had pages missing, possibly torn out or lost over the years. It might have been normal wear and tear, or maybe something more sinister. She kindly advised me not to let this overshadow my studies. Your Granddad's body of work speaks for itself, she said. Even if there was a minor discrepancy, it doesn't negate his contributions. I appreciated her support, but part of me couldn't shake the fear that more secrets lurked out there, waiting to be unearthed, especially after Uncle Raymond's meltdown. My nightmares started. I'd dream of running through a museum corridor, chased by shadowy figures, each brandishing diaries that crumbled to dust. I'd wake drenched in sweat, heart pounding. I found the media coverage was surprisingly brief. A local paper ran a small story about Family Feud Disrupts Museum Exhibit. They got a few details wrong, calling Raymond a distant cousin or something. And they didn't mention the possibility of forged records, so it didn't blow up into a scandal. The museum probably wanted to keep it quiet. I couldn't blame them. Who wants a tarnished exhibit? Months later, the charges against Raymond were dropped in exchange for him paying damages to the museum for the broken glass and general disruption. He never apologized to me, but he hasn't harassed me since, apart from an occasional email rant about unfinished business. He seems to think I'm blindly worshiping Granddad's memory, that I've become part of a cover-up. Now, I'm sharing all this because the nightmares still plague me. I haven't told many people outside my immediate circle, and I thought maybe writing about it would help. Part of me wonders if I should actively investigate Granddad's archives, see if there's any truth to these allegations. Another part is terrified of confirming them. What if Uncle Raymond is right? Could Granddad have stolen credit from others? That might not sound terrifying in the typical horror sense, but to me, it's a slow, gnawing dread. like your foundation cracking beneath you. My entire life's direction was inspired by a man I adored and believed in. If that was built on lies, who am I then? Sometimes I wish Uncle Raymond had never shown up, that the suspicious letter in the storeroom was just a random hoax. I've tried talking to my mom about it, but she's cagey. She simply says, "Your grandfather did many good things. Don't let your uncle poison that." Which is all well and good, but it doesn't soothe the questions swirling in my mind. If Granddad had a lapse in integrity, how big was it? I guess that's the real horror here, the unknown consequences of a past threat. Uncle Raymond didn't pose a mortal danger, but he cracked open a door to a possibility that still haunts me. It's not some jump scare in a dark corridor. It's the creeping sense that everything you believed might be tainted. And that's a threat that follows you day and night. I'm coping by focusing on the positive aspects of Granddad's work, verified digs, well-respected publications. But that letter suggesting a forged diary doesn't vanish from my thoughts. I catch myself double-checking references in old academic journals. I wonder if I'll stumble on a footnote that unravels everything. So far, I haven't found anything conclusive. Yet. Maybe I never will. Maybe that's best. I've stepped back from big museum events for a while. I still love art history and curation, but I'm taking a slight detour in my final year to study ethics and archaeology. Perhaps part of me is preparing for the possibility of discovering something unsavory. Or maybe I'm just punishing myself for not seeing the signs earlier, as if there was anything I could have done. Anyway, that's it. That's my story. A family feud that erupted in a public museum during a marathon weekend, culminating in a confrontation over alleged forged diaries. No gore, no supernatural spooks, just the terrifying possibility that a revered ancestor might not be as pure as we always thought, and the knowledge that someone with a grudge is out there, determined to prove it. People ask why I'm so jumpy these days. It's because I'm always looking over my shoulder, worrying that Uncle Raymond or one of his associates is about to pop up with the missing piece, or that the museum will ring me, announcing they found something that changes my granddad's entire legacy. Part of me wants closure. Part of me dreads it. For now, I'll keep studying, keep my head down, and try to remember that even if Granddad had flaws, I can forge my own path. But I'll never forget that day in the storeroom, the shattered glass, the hostility in Raymond's eyes, the realization that an old family wound had festered into something truly frightening. Maybe that's the only lesson. Secrets and resentments never stay buried forever. They eventually claw their way to the surface, and when they do, you'd better be ready to face them, whether you like it or not. I've told my friends bits and pieces of this next story, but I've never laid it all out. It's honestly embarrassing how easily I fell for the trap, and how close I came to losing everything I'd worked for. If you're reading this, please don't judge me too harshly. I was naive, or maybe just exhausted, trying to get by in a scorching heat wave while juggling a new job and a shaky living situation. Either way, let my experience serve as a warning. So about 6 months ago, we had that brutal heat wave across the country. Temperatures soared past 35 degrees, and it felt like the entire city was melting. I live in a cramped studio flat in Bristol, no air conditioning, a dodgy fan that rattles like mad. I was sweaty, irritable, and desperate for a bit of cool air. My local 24H corner shop became a weird sanctuary for me, partly because it was air-conditioned, partly because the guy at the till was friendly. I'd pop in after work, loiter around the chilled drinks aisle, maybe buy a bottle of water or a bag of ice, just to feel a slight reprieve from my sauna-like flat. I'd started a new position at a small tech startup a couple of weeks prior, still trying to make a good impression. The job was intense, long hours, constant Slack messages, unrealistic deadlines. But I couldn't complain, not really, because my finances were dire. I'd been out of work for a month after leaving my previous job, toxic management, and my savings were practically gone. It was all I could do to keep up with rent and basic expenses. One night, I stepped into the 24H shop around midnight, seeking cold air and a cheap sandwich because I hadn't bothered cooking. The place was nearly empty, just me, the shop owner, a cheerful bloke named Rakesh, and a woman browsing the crisps. Rakesh greeted me with his usual, "Evening, mate, staying cool?" I was about to answer when the woman at the crisp aisle turned and smiled at me. She was tall, sharp features, wearing a loose t-shirt and shorts. We had that awkward moment of eye contact, and I gave a small nod, not thinking much of it. Then she approached the counter the same time I did, setting down a few items, a bottle of orange juice, some snacks. We sort of laughed about the late-night munchies, and she joked that this heat wave was turning her into a nocturnal creature. I agreed, making idle small talk. As Rakesh rung us up separately, she introduced herself. "I'm Farah, by the way." And I gave my name, a bit taken aback by her friendliness. Usually people keep to themselves at midnight in a corner shop. She ended up waiting for me outside, and we continued chatting. She asked if I lived nearby. I said yes, just a few streets over. She lived in the area too, apparently. We walked together for a few minutes, parted ways, no big deal. It was unusual, but in a good way. I remember thinking how nice it was to make a random connection in the city, even if we were just bonding over the blazing heat. She seemed normal enough, confident, a quick smile, spoke about working as a freelance consultant. Over the next week, I bumped into her at the shop a few more times. Each time, the conversation grew friendlier. Farah asked about my job, my interests. I tried not to overshare, but it felt good to vent about the stress of my new position. She was surprisingly sympathetic. At one point, she mentioned she had some experience with tech startups, so she understood the grind. We even swapped numbers, though I didn't expect to use them. Maybe arrange a coffee at some point, I thought. A few nights later, I was returning from work around 11, completely drained. I decided to stop by the shop for ice cream. Farah was there again. This time, she offered to walk me home. I hesitated but didn't sense any danger, so I said okay. We chatted about random stuff, from local restaurants to Netflix shows. It was nice. By the time we reached my flat, I felt a flicker of trust in her, like maybe we could be mates. She said something about grabbing a proper drink one day, and I agreed, relieved to have a potential friend in my new area. Then everything started to shift. I received an email at work the next day, from my personal account, not the office one. A cryptic message. "I have information about your company. Interested?" No signature, no details. It was suspicious, but I was swamped, so I dismissed it as spam. Later, I mentioned it to Farah in a text, just offhand, because I joked about weird spam in the past. She asked me to forward it to her, saying she was curious. I did, not thinking it was an issue. She replied, "That's definitely a blackmailer or con artist. Ignore it." I shrugged it off. But the next day I got another email, more insistent. "I know about the server vulnerabilities. Pay up or I go public." My stomach twisted. Our startup was dealing with a brand new software platform which certainly had some bugs. The idea of vulnerabilities being exposed publicly was terrifying. But how did anyone get my personal email? I forwarded that to Farah too, feeling uneasy. She didn't reply right away. At the same time, my manager was breathing down my neck about a looming deadline. I tried to keep calm, but the stress piled on. Then Farah texted, "Meet me at the shop tonight. There's something you should see." I finished work late, so it was about 10:30 when I trudged over. She was outside, arms folded, glancing at her phone. The second she saw me, she beckoned me around the corner. I followed, heart racing. She showed me screenshots on her phone, emails from an address similar to the one that contacted me, but they contained detailed references to my startup's code structure. She said she'd gained access to them from a friend in cybersecurity, implying this blackmailer was serious and had real data. I stared, dumbfounded. She gave me a grave look. "They want a few grand in Bitcoin. If you don't pay, they might ruin your company's reputation." I felt a surge of panic. "But I'm just a junior developer. Why target me?" She shrugged. "Maybe they found your personal info online. Maybe they think you'll quietly pay before your boss finds out." She tapped the phone. "Look, I might be able to help. I've dealt with these situations before." That's when alarm bells rang in my mind. "Why are you involved in all this?" I asked, suddenly wary. Farah just insisted she had contacts who could trace the blackmailer's IP or intercept the transactions. I was too overwhelmed to question it properly. I told her I couldn't just cough up thousands. She suggested a plan. I'd take out a short-term loan, pay the blackmailer, and end the threat quietly. She emphasized that if my boss discovered the vulnerability leak, I'd be sacked, or the company might fold before I'd even got started. She made it sound dire, like my entire livelihood was on the line. Stupidly, I fell for it. I was desperate, overheated, exhausted, and not thinking straight. Farah led me through the steps. How to buy Bitcoin online, how to transfer it. She even recommended a shady loan site. I was on autopilot, doping myself up on the hope that once I paid, the blackmailer would vanish. The next few days were a blur of anxious messages with her, frantic attempts to gather money, and non-stop stress from work. I couldn't sleep in the sweltering flat. I kept going back to that 24H shop for cold drinks, half dazed. Finally, I paid. The blackmailer emailed back, "Payment received." I breathed a sigh of relief. For a moment I thought it was over, but less than 24 hours later, I got yet another message demanding more, or they'd leak everything. I called Farah in a panic. Her line was dead. I texted her. No response. That's when it clicked. I'd been set up. She was never my friend or some random neighbor. She was part of the scam. That moment of realization made my stomach churn. I'd lost thousands of pounds I didn't even have, all under the guise of protecting my new job. I felt humiliated and furious, but mostly scared. If the blackmailer was just going to keep pushing, what could I do? I decided to come clean to my boss. I scheduled a private meeting, explained the suspicious emails, but left out the part about me actually paying. My boss listened, face grim, then said they'd loop in the company's legal department. They also insisted I report it to the police. I was terrified the firm would sack me for being naive enough to pay a scammer, but they didn't, at least not right then. When I left the office that evening, it was still unbearably hot. My shirt clung to my skin. I felt dizzy with stress. My phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. "Don't think you can hide. Pay again or your bosses find out everything." I wanted to smash my phone in frustration. I decided then and there to ring the police, especially after discovering Farah had blocked me on every platform. The next day, I visited my local station. The officer I spoke with was patient, though I could tell they were a bit exasperated at the complexity. I handed over the emails, told them about Farah, described her appearance, where we'd met. They took notes, told me they'd investigate. They also advised me to inform my bank and freeze any suspicious transactions, contact the loan company, all that. It was humiliating to detail how thoroughly I'd been scammed. That evening, I couldn't bear the heat in my flat, so I decided to stay at a mate's place. Before leaving, I made one last stop at the 24H shop, partly out of habit, partly to see if Rakesh had noticed anything about Farah. He'd heard bits of gossip, but nothing concrete. He said he'd seen her in the shop earlier, acting jumpy. She'd left quickly when she realized Rakesh recognized her. He offered to show me the CCTV if I wanted, though it was probably not very high quality. I called the police again, told them there might be CCTV footage of her, hoping it would help. The following days were a whirlwind of damage control. My bank blocked the initial transfer, but I was already roped into a loan with extortionate interest. My boss was supportive, but made it clear the company had zero tolerance for further slip-ups. I was on thin ice. I felt constantly on edge, scanning the streets for any sign of Farah. The heat wave only intensified, making me feel trapped in my own sweaty nightmare. One night, I was alone in my mate's spare room, phone buzzing with overdue payment reminders, when I got an email from the blackmailer again. "I can get more if I want. Don't think you're safe." Attached was a photo of me leaving the 24H shop with Farah, time-stamped. My blood ran cold. They'd been documenting me, maybe from a distance. Or was that from the CCTV? Did they have inside access? I tried to calm down, telling myself the police were on it. Still, I was petrified. Every time I heard footsteps behind me in the street, my skin crawled. At work, I was jumpy whenever I got an email notification. My performance suffered. Colleagues asked if I was ill. I just blamed the heat. But inside, I was unraveling. After a week or so, the police got back to me. They'd identified Farah as part of a known blackmail ring that specifically targeted stressed professionals, often picking them out in late-night or 24/8 shops. She'd gain their trust, orchestrate a fake security breach, then push them into paying hush money. The men behind the emails were likely her associates. It was slick and well-rehearsed. The worst news was that they hadn't caught her yet. She'd disappeared from the area. When I heard that, I broke down. The sense of violation was huge. I'd been singled out, manipulated. I told the officer I was ready to testify if they found her. Meanwhile, I tried to move forward. The blackmailer's emails kept coming, demanding more, but now I wasn't alone. I had the police advising me. They told me to ignore further demands, block addresses, and let them handle it. Eventually, the messages trickled off, probably because they realized I was no longer a soft target. The fallout was tough. I owed money to the loan company, which took me months to pay back with crippling interest. My boss, while sympathetic, gave me a formal warning for using personal emails to handle sensitive company concerns. I nearly lost my job. The heat wave ended, but the memory of that sweaty, anxious period stuck with me. Sometimes I can't even bring myself to go into that corner shop. It reminds me too much of how naive I was, standing there at midnight, thinking I'd made a friendly acquaintance. I'm in a better place now, though still paying off debts. I recently moved to a different neighborhood, partly to get away from the constant reminder of Farah. I've changed all my passwords, beefed up my online security, and I'm wary of random strangers who strike up conversation too quickly. It's sad, really, because I used to pride myself on being friendly and open. Now I keep my guard up. I decided to write it all out because the shame was eating at me. It's easy to look back and say, I'd never fall for that, until you're in a vulnerable spot, fatigued by the heat, stressed by work, longing for a friend. They prey on that. Farah was skilled. She listened attentively, said the right things, made it sound like she had my best interests at heart. Meanwhile, she and her associates collected details and built a plan to extort me. I still don't know how they got info on our startup's vulnerabilities. Maybe they faked it, or maybe they found a bug on our public test site. Either way, it was enough to scare me into paying. The police told me they've seen a rise in such manipulative schemes, especially in big cities during times of heightened stress. They sometimes call it social infiltration, where criminals worm their way into your life under a friendly guise. There's no dramatic chase scene or masked intruder. It's just a seemingly kind stranger offering help when you feel cornered. That's the real horror. No locked doors or alarms can stop it because you willingly open the door yourself. At least I wasn't physically harmed, though the financial and emotional damage was severe. I've gone to therapy, which helped me process the betrayal and guilt. I'm learning to forgive myself, to accept that we all have vulnerable moments. The big takeaway is to always question sudden alliances, especially if they center on your personal stress points. If someone you barely know offers a suspiciously tailored solution, step back and consider if they might be playing you. I still think about Farah sometimes. Wonder if she's out there in another 24/8 shop, targeting someone else. The police haven't updated me on any arrests. I hope they catch her, but I've let go of the idea of personal closure. She was just the face of a bigger operation after all. That's a sobering thought, how easily a well-organized group can dismantle your life if you're not careful. I hope sharing this helps someone else recognize the signs before it's too late. If you're feeling isolated or overheated, literally or metaphorically, and a charismatic stranger swoops in, promising relief, pause and think, are they too good to be true? Because the scariest threats aren't always the ones creeping in dark alleys. Sometimes they're the ones walking beside you, chatting about your favorite TV show, while quietly picking the lock to your livelihood. So that's my cautionary tale. A 24/8 shop in the midst of a heat wave, a friendly face that turned out to be a blackmailer's ally, and a barrage of threats that nearly cost me my career. It's not a story with a neat ending. I never got my money back or saw justice served. But I survived, learned from it, and want others to know. Trust your instincts, and never be so desperate for a friend or a quick fix that you ignore glaring red flags. Maybe if I'd listened to my gut from the start, I'd have spared myself months of sleepless nights and crippling debt. And definitely keep your workplace concerns off your personal email. If I can spare even one person from falling into a similar trap, then at least something good can come out of my humiliating brush with these predators. I suppose that's all I have to say. It still stings, but at least by putting the details down, I'm not hiding from the truth anymore. And maybe next time someone tries to strike up a chat while I'm eyeing the crisp section at midnight, I'll be polite. But I'll hold on to my caution tighter than ever. We live and learn, even in the most stifling heat.